It was late September when I decided to spend a week alone at the cabin. It wasn't a fancy place, just an old wooden structure deep in the woods of northern Idaho. The kind of place with a tin roof that popped and cracked during the day as the sun moved across it. No cell signal, no internet, just thick trees and absolute silence. I didn't go there often, maybe once or twice a year, but when I did, I liked to be completely alone. Sometimes I'd bring a notebook and write, or take long walks with no destination, or just sit on the porch and listen to the wind. The quiet was something I couldn't find in the city, and over time, I started craving it more. I drove up early in the morning, leaving before dawn. It was about a 5-hour drive from my place, and the last 45 minutes were on a dirt road that wound around the base of a small mountain. The last time I had been there was 6 months earlier, and everything was still in place then. The propane tank behind the cabin had plenty of gas, the generator worked fine, and the small wood-burning stove inside kept the place warm. I always packed dry food, canned soup, and bottled water just in case the old well pump gave out. That morning, everything seemed normal. I reached the cabin around 10 and unlocked the door. The air inside smelled like old wood and dry dust. The place was how I left it. Wood piles still stacked high, table clean, windows shut tight. I opened a few to let in some fresh air and then started unloading the back of the truck. By noon, I had everything inside and decided to take a walk before the sun dipped too low. The trail behind the cabin led up to a small clearing where I sometimes camped when I didn't feel like staying indoors. It wasn't far, maybe half a mile uphill, but it gave a decent view of the valley below, especially when the trees were starting to turn red and orange. I didn't see or hear anything strange on the walk. No animals, no people, just wind brushing through branches and the distant creaking of trees. I sat at the clearing for about 30 minutes and then started heading back down. The only thing that caught my attention was an old rusty tin can near the base of a pine tree, something I hadn't noticed before. It looked like one of those old bean cans from decades ago. It was dented, faded, and clearly had been there a long time. I figured it had washed out from somewhere or maybe was left behind by 100 years ago. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. When I got back to the cabin, I made a small fire in the stove and heated up a can of chili. I sat on the front porch to eat. The sky had turned a deep orange behind the trees, and everything looked peaceful. That's one of the best things about being out there. The world feels slower. But that night, around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a nightmare or any loud sound that startled me. It was just this weird stillness, like the woods had stopped breathing. Usually at night, even if it's quiet, you'll hear insects, maybe the wind, or branches cracking as animals move. But that night, nothing. Not even the hum of the fridge I powered with the generator. I sat up in bed and just listened. Nothing moved. I stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes, not scared yet, just uneasy. Eventually, I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I went about my usual routine. Made some instant coffee, did a bit of reading, and started chopping more firewood. Around noon, I went out to check the shed, which was about 30 yards from the cabin, surrounded by overgrown brush. I kept extra tools in there, an old chainsaw, some fishing rods, a tarp, a few empty gas cans. The door creaked as I opened it, and right away I saw something I didn't expect. There were footprints in the dirt just inside the doorway. They weren't mine. I hadn't been inside the shed since my last visit. These looked recent. The dust was disturbed, and there were small scuff marks leading toward the back wall where the workbench was. I stepped inside, suddenly aware of how quiet it was again. I followed the prints. They didn't go far, just circled the bench and stopped near the window. The window was shut, but something had been dragged across the bench, a line of cleared dust about the width of a hand. I stood there staring at it for a while, then backed out slowly and closed the door. I didn't panic. I figured maybe an animal had wandered in and left those marks. Maybe a raccoon or something stepped in through a crack. But the door had been shut, and there weren't any holes big enough for something to get in. I thought about checking the cabin for signs of entry, but everything was still locked. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter, looking for any signs of someone nearby. I didn't find anything. That night, I made sure to lock every door and window. I even pushed the heavy dresser in front of the back door. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard something. Finally, a sound. At first, it was faint, like someone dragging a stick along the side of the cabin. I sat up and held my breath, passed slowly along the right wall, near the bedroom. I could hear the scraping pause every few seconds, then continue. It circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't get up. I just stayed there, frozen. After maybe 15 minutes, I finally reached over and grabbed the flashlight from the side table. I crept to the window and looked out into the dark. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't see anything, but that didn't help. I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I started to regret coming alone. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the side of the cabin, just beneath the bedroom window, were scratches, long, deliberate gouges in the wood. They weren't random. They formed a line about 4 feet long and roughly the height of a person's arm span. It looked like someone dragged something sharp across the wall. I ran my fingers along it. It was fresh. The wood was still splintered and clean where it had been scraped. That was when I finally admitted something wasn't right. I packed my bag with essentials: wallet, keys, flashlight, knife, snacks, and kept it near the door. I didn't want to leave yet, but I wanted to be ready. I spent the rest of the day near the cabin. No walks, no shed. Just sat on the porch with my back to the door and my eyes on the trees. I thought maybe it was a hunter messing with me, maybe a local kid. But this place was miles from any town, and the dirt road didn't show any new tire tracks. Nobody would be out here without a reason. That night, just after the sun disappeared, I saw him. I was inside, sitting by the stove with only the firelight glowing across the walls. I heard a crunch outside, something stepping on dry leaves. Then another. I didn't move. I listened, heart pounding in my chest. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. They circled the cabin and paused near the front door. I crept over to the window next to the door and peeked through the curtain. A man was standing near the shed, half hidden behind the trunk of a tree. He was facing the cabin, still as a rock, not moving. He wore a dark jacket and something on his head, maybe a beanie or hood. His hands were in his pockets. I watched him for a full minute and he didn't move at all. I backed away and grabbed the hunting rifle I always kept in the back room. I loaded it but didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the dark, gun across my lap, waiting. At some point during the night, I must have fallen asleep sitting up. When I woke up, it was light outside and the man was gone. I walked to the shed the moment I stepped out. The door was wide open. The inside had been rifled through. Stuff on the floor, tools moved, gas can missing. On the inside of the door, scratched into the wood, were the words, "Stay quiet." The letters were jagged, like they'd been carved in with a knife or nail. That was it for me. I packed the rest of my gear in a rush. I didn't clean up or lock the place. I threw everything into the truck and sped down the dirt road, checking the mirror constantly. My hands shook on the wheel, and I kept expecting to see someone step out into the road. But I didn't. I reached the main highway just after noon and didn't stop driving until I got home that night. I called the county sheriff the next morning and told them what happened. They sent someone out. A deputy called me 3 days later and said the cabin was undisturbed. No signs of anyone, no footprints, nothing in the shed. They said the scratch marks could have been from a bear or old damage. They didn't seem concerned. I didn't go back for 6 months. When I did, everything was more or less how I left it, except the shed door was missing entirely, just gone, like someone had taken it off the hinges and walked away with it. And on the back wall of the cabin, near the base, barely visible in the moss, were the same words again. Asterisk, asterisk, stay quiet, asterisk, asterisk, scratched low where the grass met the wood. I haven't been back since. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything. The stress from work, my phone constantly buzzing, the noise of the city. It had all started to feel like a thick cloud pressing down on me. I needed silence, real silence, the kind that makes your ears ring at night because there's no background hum. So, I took a week off and found a small cabin listed on an old travel site. It was deep in the woods of northern Idaho, remote, isolated, and not some cozy little Instagram retreat. It looked rugged and untouched, and that was exactly what I wanted. I drove up the winding road, miles away from any gas station or diner. My phone lost signal halfway there, which oddly felt like a relief. The forest around the road grew denser as I climbed, trees closing in tight like a tunnel. The further I went, the less I saw signs of people. No tire marks, no mailboxes, nothing. I eventually reached a small wooden sign nailed to a post, McKinley Trail Private Access. The cabin was about a mile up from there, off a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen a car in years. The cabin itself looked just like the photos. Single floor, old logs darkened by years of weather, a tin roof with pine needles piled on it, and a porch with a few broken steps. There was no power, no running water, just a hand pump outside and a wood stove for heat. The outhouse stood about 20 yards behind the cabin. A small creek ran nearby, and I could hear it faintly trickling through the trees. The first thing I did when I arrived was unload the firewood I brought, stack it on the porch, and sweep away the dried leaves that had blown in through the open windows. Then I unpacked some canned food, bottled water, my sleeping bag, a flashlight, batteries, a hunting knife, and my emergency radio. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong, but I liked being prepared. The first day went by slowly, which was what I wanted. I walked around, explored the nearby woods, sat by the creek, and even found some deer tracks in the mud. I saw no one, no planes in the sky, no faraway hum of engines, just the sound of leaves shifting in the breeze. That night, I sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the pines. As the temperature dropped, I started a fire in the stove and settled into the cabin. I used my flashlight sparingly, trying to save the batteries. When I finally lay down, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods. I carried a day pack with water, snacks, and a basic map I drew of the area around the cabin. I stayed within about 2 miles, making sure I never lost sight of landmarks like the creek, a large boulder shaped like a wedge, and a tall cedar tree that stood alone in a small clearing. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon. Still no signs of people. That night, I heard some movement outside, twigs snapping, but I figured it was just deer or maybe a raccoon. The third day, things started to feel strange. I noticed something odd about the wedge-shaped boulder. It had shifted slightly. I couldn't prove it, but I was sure the narrow side used to point downhill, not uphill. I shook it off. Maybe I remembered it wrong. Later that afternoon, I found boot prints by the creek. Not mine. These were wider, deeper, like someone wearing heavy work boots. I followed them for a bit, but they led off into a dense part of the forest. It didn't feel right to keep going. I turned back, unease settling in my gut. That night, I barricaded the door with a small shelf and moved the table in front of it. Not because I was scared exactly, but because I suddenly felt very aware of how alone I was out there. I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the cabin wall, a low scraping sound. I held my knife in my sleeping bag and waited until morning. On the fourth day, I found a small bundle near the pump. It was wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. Inside were a handful of mushrooms, 2 pine cones, and a small wooden carving. The carving was rough, almost primitive. It looked like a human figure with no face, just hollow where the eyes should be. My stomach turned when I saw it. I didn't touch it again. I tossed the whole bundle far into the woods and tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. But something in my gut told me it was a warning or a message. That night, I didn't start a fire. I stayed low, kept the flashlight off. I covered the windows with my blanket and used my jacket as a pillow. The wind picked up that night, and the trees groaned like they were warning me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faceless carving. On the 5th morning, I found more tracks, multiple sets. Some were boot prints, others were bare feet. Big, calloused feet. It didn't make sense. I followed the trail for about a 1/4 mile before I found a tree with long scratch marks on it. Fresh ones. like someone dragged a blade or claw down the bark. The edges were splintered, and I could still see sap dripping. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something had been moved inside. My sleeping bag was in a different spot. My backpack was open. Nothing was missing, but someone had gone through my stuff. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at everything, trying to make sense of it. The only reason I didn't leave that day was because my truck was parked about a mile and a half back down the trail, and I didn't feel safe making the walk at dusk. That night, I kept the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like whispering outside. Not words, just breathy noises, like someone trying to speak without sound. I stayed as still as I could. Then came the tapping. Slow, light tapping on the window beside the stove. Just one tap every few seconds. I stared at the blanket covering it, trying to will myself to move, to check. But I couldn't. I stayed frozen until the sun finally came up. On the 6th day, I packed everything. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed what I could into my backpack and carried the rest. I made it halfway down the trail before I realized the forest felt different. Heavier. The air smelled off like rotting leaves and something else. Something sour. I walked faster. Then I saw it. A tree blocking the trail. It had fallen recently, maybe during the night. But when I looked closer, I saw that the trunk had been cut. Not broken by wind. Someone had dropped it on purpose. My chest tightened. I scanned the woods around me. Nothing. No movement. I had no choice but to go off trail, trying to loop around the fallen tree and get back to the road. But the terrain got worse the further I went. Thick underbrush, uneven ground, hidden holes. I slipped several times. At one point, I twisted my ankle stepping into a rut hidden under leaves. The pain shot up my leg, but I kept going. I didn't care. I just needed to reach the road. It took hours, but I finally found the gravel road. My truck was parked in the same spot, but someone had gone through it. The glove box was open, the back seat scattered with wrappers and torn paper. My map was missing. I didn't stop to check anything. I threw my stuff in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. Not once. The first gas station I reached was over 30 miles away. I pulled in, locked the doors, and sat there for 10 minutes before getting out. I told myself it was over. I made it out, but I didn't feel safe again for a long time. Weeks went by where I couldn't sleep unless all the lights were on. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure carved into that little wooden doll. I never reported it. Who would I tell? And what would I even say? Months later, I looked up the area. The McKinley Trail wasn't on any official map. I checked topographic maps, Forest Service records, everything. It was like it didn't exist. Like the whole stretch of land was swallowed up by the forest and forgotten. I still think about it. Sometimes, I wonder if whoever left that carving meant to scare me away or if I just got lucky and left before something worse happened. Either way, I'll never go back. Not to that part of the woods. Not to any remote cabin again. I wanted silence. I got it. But what I didn't expect was that out there, where no one can hear you scream, someone, might be listening anyway. I don't usually talk about what happened that weekend because every time I start to think about it, my body gets tight and my chest feels heavy. But I've kept it bottled up for too long. Maybe writing it down will help clear the weight a little. This is what happened the weekend I decided to spend 4 days alone in a cabin up in the northern woods of Minnesota. I had found the cabin through a local classified site. It was owned by an older man who had stopped using it after his knees gave out. He posted it for rent at a cheap rate. No luxuries, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, no nearby town. Just a basic log structure, a wood stove, a bunk bed, a table, a water pump, and an outhouse. That was all I wanted. After months of sitting behind a desk and barely seeing daylight, I needed time away from people and noise. I arrived on a Thursday morning. The sky was a pale blue and there was a slight chill in the air. The gravel road was rough and narrow. Pine trees crowded in from both sides, brushing the side mirrors of my car. I followed the directions carefully, turning off the main road, down a rutted track, and finally arriving at a clearing where the cabin sat like a forgotten toy. The wood was dark and weathered. The small porch sagged a little in the middle. There was a rusted axe leaning beside the door, and a pile of old wood stacked neatly along the side. The first day went by quietly. I unpacked, walked the perimeter, and settled in. The forest around the cabin was thick, full of moss and fallen branches. I didn't see any animals, but I could hear birds and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I didn't bring much: some dried food, bottled water, a few paperbacks, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I didn't plan to use the flashlight unless I had to, since the place had candles and a lantern. That night, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. The temperature dropped quickly. I pulled on a hoodie and lit a candle inside, leaving the door open a crack so I could still smell the pine trees. The air was crisp and clean. For the first time in months, my shoulders felt loose. At some point, I went inside and closed the door. I locked it even though I knew no one would be out there. I set up my sleeping bag on the bottom bunk, crawled in, and listened to the soft creaking of the cabin as it settled. The woods were completely silent. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I don't know what time it was because I had turned my phone off, but it was still dark. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. Something light scraping across the porch. It was slow, like a branch being dragged. Then it stopped. I held my breath and waited. My eyes were open, but I couldn't see much. The candle had burned out. I didn't want to grab the flashlight unless I really needed it. I figured it could be an animal, a raccoon maybe. I told myself to go back to sleep, but I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. The pile of firewood was the same. The axe was still leaning beside the door, but I noticed a faint line in the dirt across the porch. It was curved, like something had been dragged. I stared at it for a long time, then brushed it off. The second day, I hiked further into the woods. I didn't have a trail to follow, just a general sense of where I was. I made sure to mark trees with small cuts as I went, so I wouldn't get turned around. The forest was beautiful and calm, but there was a strange stillness to it. I didn't see any squirrels, no deer, no movement at all. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I came back before it got too dark. I was tired, and my legs ached from walking over uneven ground. I boiled water on the small stove and ate some freeze-dried food. As night came, I lit another candle and kept it on the table while I lay in the bunk. Again, sometime in the night, I woke up. This time, it was a different sound, closer, softer. Something was brushing against the wall of the cabin, just behind my head. A slow, steady scrape, then silence. Then again. It repeated every 10 seconds or so. I lay there, trying not to move. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to open the door and look outside. I didn't want to make any noise. I stayed frozen until the sound stopped completely. I counted to 200 in my head before I finally fell asleep again. In the morning, I went around to the back wall. There was nothing there. No marks, no tracks, no sign that anything had touched the wall. I didn't understand it. The trees were about 10 feet back from the cabin. There was no wind that night. Still, I tried to forget it. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read for a while, chopped a little wood, and cleaned up the outhouse area. The air was colder. The sky stayed overcast. Around midday, I noticed something strange. One of the marks I had carved into a tree was gone. It was like someone had scraped the bark smooth again. I found the next tree I had marked, and that one still had the cut. But the missing one bothered me. It was about 200 yards from the cabin. I didn't have an explanation for it. That night, I kept the flashlight close. I left the lantern lit instead of using a candle. I stayed awake longer, trying to listen. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it came from under the cabin. It was a low, thudding sound, like something bumping against the floorboards from below. Came at odd intervals. Sometimes 2 bumps closed together. Then silence. Then one long bump. I got out of the bunk slowly, grabbed the flashlight, and knelt by the floor. The light didn't show any gaps or holes. I went outside. I walked all the way around the cabin. I crouched and shined the light under it. The space underneath was narrow, maybe 2 feet high at most. All I saw was dirt and dead leaves. No animals, nothing unusual, but I was shaken. I went back inside, locked the door and kept the light on. I didn't sleep. On the last day, I packed my things early. I was supposed to stay one more night, but I had decided to leave before dark. I was too tense. I didn't feel safe anymore. As I loaded the car, I noticed more of the trees I had marked were missing their cuts. For in total, I hadn't marked them carelessly. I had used the same knife and same depth for each one. I drove away, trying to focus on the road. But 10 minutes after I left the clearing, I had to stop. My rearview mirror showed someone standing at the edge of the road, right where the path met the forest. They weren't there a second before. They stood still. I only saw them for a second before I turned a bend and the trees blocked the view. I didn't go back to check. I didn't stop again until I reached the highway. I didn't call the owner or ask for a refund. I just drove home and promised myself I wouldn't go back to a place that remote again. It's been almost a year since then. I still don't know what happened during those nights. I don't have any proof of anything, but I've thought about it so much, I know I didn't imagine it. The marks on the trees, the sounds, the dragging, those were real. Sometimes at night, when things are quiet, I still hear that slow scrape in the back of my head. But I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will. It was late October when I drove out to the cabin. The leaves were already turning dark orange and red, and the air had that damp, sharp bite to it that meant winter was just around the corner. I'd rented the place for a full week. My plan was to clear my head, stay off my phone, and try to figure some things out about work and life. I had no idea that trip would leave me with scars I'd never talk about again. The cabin was about 25 minutes off the nearest paved road. I had to take an old logging trail that had nearly faded from use. Most of the drive was slow and bumpy. I was alone and I liked it that way. I wanted silence and the area had plenty of that. There were no other cabins nearby, just woods and an old river that curved through the bottom of a narrow valley. The cabin was small, built out of faded timber, and had a tin roof that clicked every time the wind picked up. I got there in the early afternoon. I parked my car on the patch of gravel beside the porch, hauled my bags inside, and lit the fireplace. The air inside was cold, and it smelled like dust and pine. There was no cell service, and the nearest neighbor was probably 6 or 7 miles away. The cabin had a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, a single bathroom with a rust-stained tub, and a creaky bed with flannel sheets. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't need it to be. The first night passed quietly. I made pasta, drank some cheap wine, and read for a while before turning in. The wind rattled the windows, and the roof popped once or twice, but that was normal. I left the porch light on, just in case some animal got curious. Felt peaceful. No distractions, no work emails, no people. The second day I went for a hike. There was a trail behind the cabin that cut through the woods and followed the ridge. I hiked about 5 miles out and saw a small waterfall. No signs of other hikers. No boot prints, no candy wrappers, nothing. Just leaves, bare trees, and silence. On the way back, I thought I saw something in the distance. Something dark standing just inside the tree line. But when I looked again, it was gone. Probably a stump. My mind played tricks sometimes. Back at the cabin, I made soup, wrote in a notebook for a while, and read some more. Around 10, I heard something outside. A single thump. Not loud, just dull. I turned off the lights and peeked through the curtains. I didn't see anything. It was probably a branch or something falling off the roof. I went back to bed. The third day was colder. I wore my jacket even inside. The fireplace helped, but not much. I stayed inside most of the day and cooked a bigger meal. Roast potatoes and frozen chicken I'd brought in a cooler. Around dusk, I went out to chop some kindling. That's when I noticed something odd. On the edge of the gravel driveway, just past the reach of the porch light, the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had kicked it around or shuffled their feet. I told myself it was probably me from the day before. I didn't really believe that, but I made myself believe it anyway. I slept badly that night. I kept hearing things. Not loud sounds, just soft ones, like someone moving very slowly outside. I didn't see anything, even when I checked the windows again and again. It wasn't until morning that I noticed the porch. There were marks on the wood, scuff marks, dirty spots, like boots had scraped it. I hadn't walked on that side of the porch at all. I would have remembered. By the fourth day, I was starting to feel watched. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a voice, hadn't seen any vehicle on the trail, but something felt off. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, especially when I was outside. I started locking the cabin door even during the day. I set up an old wind chime I found in a cabinet, hung it by the back door so I'd hear if something bumped it. I also put my hatchet beside the bed, just in case. I didn't like how that felt, but I liked the feeling of being unprepared even less. That night, I heard the wind chime jingle. It was a slow, quiet sound, metal on metal. I was wide awake in an instant. I lay there, breathing through my mouth, straining to hear more. It was followed by the creak of wood, like weight being shifted on the porch boards. I didn't get up. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, clutching the hatchet, heart pounding. The sound stopped after a while, maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. I stayed awake until dawn. When I stepped outside that morning, I saw clear prints in the frost. Boot prints. They came up the steps, stood near the door, then walked back off the porch. The prints didn't go toward the driveway. They vanished into the woods. I thought about leaving. I really did. But the nearest town was over an hour away, and I'd already paid for the week. I told myself it was just some hiker who got lost. Maybe a hunter. I told myself I was being dramatic. That's what I kept telling myself, over and over. That afternoon, I went out and gathered a pile of thick branches. I dragged them back and stacked them against the cabin door. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might buy me time. I also nailed 2 boards across the inside of the back door using some old hardware I found in the kitchen drawer. That night, everything stayed quiet until just after 1 in the morning. I woke up to footsteps, not soft ones, heavy, deliberate ones crunching the gravel outside. Then I heard the boards on the porch creak again. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet. The footsteps stopped. Then came a soft tapping. Knuckles or something harder, gently tapping on the window glass. Not the door, the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. 5 minutes later, I heard the chime ring again. I stayed in bed until daylight. I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, I went outside again. More footprints. These were different. The treads looked wider, like work boots. The prints circled the cabin this time, paused at every window, stopped by the firewood pile. Whoever it was had walked the full perimeter. I made a decision. I started packing. I loaded up everything as fast as I could. Food, gear, everything. When I got to the car, I noticed something chilling. Someone had scraped the passenger side door. Not deep, but long. A mark, jagged and deliberate, running from the mirror down to the handle. I turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Third time, still nothing. Just a clicking noise. I popped the hood. The battery cables had been cut. Clean. Someone had done it with a knife or wire cutter. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't weather or time. That was a person. I stood there, in the cold, in the middle of nowhere, trying not to lose it. I went back inside and locked every door. I tried the emergency radio I'd brought. No signal. The trail was too far to walk by night, and I didn't trust what, or who, I might run into out there in the dark. I made it through that night without sleeping. I sat in the far corner of the cabin with the hatchet in my lap, staring at the front door. I kept the fire low so no light would show through the windows. At 3:47 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it wasn't footsteps or tapping. It was metal, a sharp scraping sound, like a blade being dragged across wood. Then it stopped. No more noises, just silence. Morning finally came. I didn't even wait. I started walking. I took my pack, left the car, and followed the trail back to the logging road. My legs hurt, my hands were numb, but I didn't stop. I walked for nearly 6 hours before I saw another person. A hunter, maybe in his 60s. He looked surprised to see me. I must have looked like hell. He let me use his satellite phone. I called a tow truck and the police. I told them everything. They said they'd send someone to check it out. When they finally got to the cabin, they found signs of forced entry on the back window. Someone had tried to pry it open but failed. There were prints, scratches, marks all around the cabin. The tow truck guy replaced the battery. He said he'd never seen such a clean-cut job in a place like that. The police didn't find anyone. No arrests, no suspects, just a report filed and a warning. Next time, don't go out there alone. I never went back. I still think about that week sometimes. Not often. Just when the wind picks up and I hear a branch tap against my window. Just when I'm home alone and hear a sound I can't explain right away. Just when I see boots like the ones I saw in those prints. I keep my doors locked now. Even during the day, I check the windows before bed. I keep my phone charged. And I never, ever rent cabins in the woods anymore. Some places, even without ghosts or monsters, are still dangerous. Because people can be worse than anything we make up in stories. And I met one of those people, out there, in the woods, watching me for days, waiting. It was late September when I decided to take a break from everything. I was tired of the noise, the endless notifications, and the way the city just kept swallowing my time. I had a week off from work and didn't tell many people about my plan. I just packed up my SUV, bought enough supplies for 7 days, and drove out to a cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room place with no electricity or running water, tucked away at the end of a long dirt road that didn't even show up on most maps. The cabin sat by a lake that didn't have a name, or if it did, it wasn't marked. It was the kind of place that made you feel small. Trees surrounded everything, tall and close together, and the only sounds were the wind, birds, and sometimes a distant rustling that I guessed was from deer or raccoons. The air was cold but clean. The sky looked sharper there, like someone had taken a blade to the clouds and carved them perfectly. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked, stacked the firewood I brought, checked the little outhouse behind the cabin, and made a fire inside. I had my old camping stove and brought along cans of soup, beans, coffee, and a cooler packed with ice. I had books, a journal, and a solar-powered lamp. I kept things simple on purpose. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag on the wooden floor, listening to the wind tap the window, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears. I heard something walk around the cabin once or twice during the night, but I figured it was just an animal sniffing around. I stayed still, heart beating a little harder than I expected, but nothing came of it. By the second day, I settled in. I went fishing at the lake, hiked a few trails I found, and chopped some wood. I kept my phone off the entire time. That night, I lit a fire and watched the sky until it got too cold. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, but I also noticed how the trees around the cabin looked different in the dark. Not scary, just off. They seemed to lean closer, like shadows got deeper between the trunks. The next few days were calm, but I began noticing small things that didn't make sense. My firewood pile looked different one morning, like someone had moved the top pieces. I kept thinking maybe I did it and forgot. Then one afternoon, I found my knife missing from the kitchen counter. I searched everywhere inside the cabin and finally found it halfway down the trail leading to the lake. I didn't remember carrying it out there. I began double-checking the locks at night, even though the cabin door was just a simple latch and hook. I started keeping my flashlight within reach. I even kept the axe next to my sleeping bag. I wasn't scared, not really, but I felt watched. Not constantly, just at random times, like someone was peeking out from behind a tree, just for a second, then vanishing. On the 5th night, I heard something heavy outside. It wasn't footsteps. It was more like dragging, like someone pulling something large over the dirt and leaves. I sat up slowly, flashlight in hand, and listened. It circled the cabin once, then stopped right by the window. I didn't dare shine the light. I just stayed still and held my breath. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I went outside and found long marks in the dirt, like something had been dragged. Not fresh, almost like someone tried to erase them. There were faint footprints too, bare feet, human. I tried telling myself they could be from before I got here, but the trail led behind the cabin where I never went. I stayed inside most of that day. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept the axe close. Around sunset, I forced myself to go outside and check the outhouse. I needed to feel normal, but when I opened the outhouse door, I found something inside. On the seat was a folded piece of old paper. Picked it up and opened it. It was a torn page from a notebook. Someone had written, "Leave," just that, one word, written in pencil, messy and crooked. I looked around. Nothing, just trees. I backed away, went straight to the cabin, and locked the door. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't even cook. I just sat in the dark, listening. There were no footsteps that night, no dragging sounds, nothing. But I didn't sleep. The 6th day, I decided I would leave early. I had planned to stay a full week, but I had a bad feeling that I couldn't shake. I packed what I could into the SUV, but when I went to start it, nothing happened. Battery was dead. I checked the hood. Everything looked fine. I tried again. Still nothing. I even tried my jumper pack. Still nothing. It was like the battery had just drained. I had no way to call anyone. No reception. No signal. And I was too far in to walk out and back before dark. I tried to stay calm and told myself I would hike out at sunrise. I still had food. Still had water. Just one more night. But that night was different. It started with tapping. Soft taps on the window, like fingers, one at a time. Then I heard something moving up on the roof. Not fast. Slow, dragging movements. I held my breath and didn't move. Then it all went quiet. For maybe half an hour. Then something knocked on the cabin door. Not once. 3 times. Slow and steady. Then silence again. I sat there all night, axe in hand. Heart pounding so hard I thought it would stop. I never looked out the window. I never made a sound. I waited for morning like it was a lifeline. At first light, I grabbed what I needed and left. I didn't pack. I didn't clean. I just left. The trail back was long and took hours, but I made it to the main road by late afternoon. A passing truck picked me up and dropped me in town. I didn't tell the driver what happened. I didn't tell anyone. A few days later, I returned with a friend and a tow truck to get my SUV. When we got there, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, all the firewood I stacked was burned in the middle of the floor. My books were torn up. The cooler was empty. The knife was gone again. And written on the wall, scratched into the wood, was one word: stay. That was over a year ago. I never went back. I sold the SUV and never tried to get the cabin deposit back. I don't go camping anymore. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know it was human. I know someone had been watching me from the start. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking I hear that slow tapping on my window. I keep the blinds closed now, and I always check the locks twice, just in case. It started with a simple plan. I just wanted some time away from work, from the constant buzzing of my phone, from people. I booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, far from cell towers and streetlights, a place where the air was still clean, the nights pitch black, and no one knew who I was. I found it through a small local rental site. It wasn't listed on the big ones, just a simple post with a few photos and some basic directions. The guy renting it out said it had no Wi-Fi, no electricity, just a gas stove and lanterns. That was perfect. That was exactly what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. Once I turned off the main highway, I followed a gravel road for miles, then another dirt trail, winding through thick trees and marshy ditches. My car rattled over potholes, and branches scraped along the sides. The GPS gave up after the second turn, but I followed the printed directions. Finally, I reached the clearing. The cabin was smaller than I expected. More of a shack really, with dark, weathered wood and a tin roof. But it stood alone, surrounded by tall pines, and I felt a strange sense of peace just looking at it. There was a tiny porch out front with 2 old chairs and a small pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly to the side. Inside, it was just one room with a small kitchen area, a cot with a thin mattress, a wood stove, and a table with 2 chairs. A lantern hung from a nail on the wall. There was an outhouse about 20 yards out back, just off a narrow trail. I unpacked my cooler, my backpack, and a few books. I planned to read, maybe write in my journal, and mostly just breathe without anyone expecting anything from me. The first day was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. I didn't hear any cars, no airplanes overhead, no voices, just birds, and now and then, the sound of squirrels rustling in the underbrush. That night, I lit the lantern and cooked a simple dinner on the gas stove. The silence felt heavier after dark. I noticed how loud small sounds became, a twig snapping, the creak of the cabin as it settled. I reminded myself it was normal. Old buildings make noise. The forest is alive. Still, I didn't sleep well. By the second day, I started to settle in. I woke up early, made some instant coffee on the stove, and sat outside again. I hiked a bit through the woods around the cabin, though I stayed close since there weren't any marked trails. I found a small stream not far from the cabin, and I sat there for a while, throwing pebbles in and watching the water move. I felt better than I had in months. There was no pressure to be anywhere or do anything. No schedule. I didn't even check the time most of the day. That night, I noticed something odd. I had gone to bed early, and I must have been asleep for a few hours when I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was faint, but it was rhythmic, like a tapping, not like the random creaks of the night before. This was more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, listening so hard my ears ached. Then I heard it again. This time it was quicker. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from just outside one of the walls. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the side of the cabin. Maybe the wind had picked up. I got up and went to the window. I held the lantern close, but I couldn't see much through the fogged glass. Just trees and shadows. I didn't open the door. I figured if it was an animal or the wind, it would stop eventually. And it did. After a few minutes, the tapping faded, and I crawled back into the cot. Still, I didn't fall back asleep right away. On the third day, I couldn't shake the unease. Everything looked normal, but I kept replaying that sound in my head. I walked around the cabin, looking for broken branches or anything that might explain it, but I didn't find anything. The weather was calm, no wind. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the forest messing with my head. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder as I moved around. That evening, I made a fire in the wood stove for warmth. It had gotten colder. I noticed the silence again. The birds seemed quieter. No squirrels today, no rustling. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. As night fell, I felt more anxious than I had the previous nights. I left the lantern burning even after I lay down. The light made the shadows dance on the walls, but I found it more comforting than the complete darkness. Sometime after midnight, I heard the tapping again. This time it was at the back of the cabin, and it was louder. Tap, 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 then silence. Then again, a few seconds later, faster. Tap, 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 tap. I sat up, heart pounding. I held the lantern and tiptoed toward the back wall. I didn't open the door. I stood there, waiting. The sound didn't come again for a while. I finally lay down, but I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I walked out to the back of the cabin to see if I could find anything. The ground was soft with old pine needles, but I noticed something odd near the base of the wall. A set of indentations. Not deep enough to be footprints, but definitely not natural. 3 small round marks like something had tapped the ground. I crouched and examined them. They looked like someone had pushed the end of a stick into the dirt. 3 in a row. Then another set, a few inches over. Same pattern. It didn't make sense. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I kept telling myself I was just spooked. This was what I wanted. Time alone. Real isolation. Maybe it was my own mind creating something from nothing. I stayed another day. I forced myself to stay busy. I chopped some of the firewood. I gathered kindling. I even wrote a few pages in my journal, though it was mostly just thoughts about the sounds and how I couldn't explain them. That night, I made sure everything was locked. I placed a chair against the door. I turned the lantern up brighter. I even kept my boots on in case I had to get up quickly. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Not tapping this time. It was softer, a scraping, like something dragging lightly along the wood. I held my breath, my eyes wide open in the dark. It started at one side of the cabin and moved along the wall, slowly. Then it stopped. I stayed still for hours. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke up around sunrise. The lantern had gone out. The chair was still against the door. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't stop thinking about that dragging sound. I walked around the cabin again. This time, I found more of those indentations. A dozen sets now, still in threes, still evenly spaced, like someone had been tapping or poking the ground all the way around the cabin. I decided I had enough. I packed my bag, loaded everything back into the car, and locked the cabin. I was tired, edgy, and starting to feel like I was being watched all the time. The moment I turned onto the main road and got back into signal range, I felt a rush of relief. I checked my phone. No new messages. No missed calls. It was only 4 days, but it felt like weeks. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept looking at the photos I took of the stream, the trees, even the cabin itself. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but I knew how it felt being there. That strange tension in the air, the sounds at night, the marks in the dirt. I went online to see if anyone else had rented the same place. I didn't find much. The listing was gone. A few days later, I decided to call the number I used when I booked it, just to ask, maybe for closure. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. The voice sounded old, tired. I didn't leave a message. I deleted the number. That was 6 months ago. I still think about the cabin sometimes. I still have dreams about the tapping, the soft scraping. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I thought maybe I imagined it all. Maybe it was isolation playing tricks on me. But last week, I parked in my driveway after work, and as I walked up to my front door, I saw something in the dirt near my porch. 3 small indentations, in a row. Then another set, exactly the same distance apart. I didn't sleep that night. I haven't slept much since. I swept the dirt flat, but every morning, the marks are back. Always in threes, always in pairs. I never hear anything. I never see anything, but I know it's there. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it followed me or if it was always here, but I can't go back to who I was before that trip. I see the world differently now. Quieter places feel more dangerous. Silence makes me uneasy. I wanted peace. I got something else. It was late September when I decided to get away for a few days. I had been working nonstop for months, and my head felt like it was always buzzing. I needed silence. Not just a quiet evening, but full-on silence. No city noise, no phone calls, no people. Just me, alone, somewhere deep in the woods. I booked a cabin through a small rental website. It wasn't listed on any big travel sites. Just a simple web page with a few photos and an email contact. The owner replied fast, said the place was available, and gave me directions. The cabin was near a lake, 2 hours away from the nearest town. No cell service out there, and I was told the Wi-Fi barely worked. That sounded perfect. I packed light, just a backpack with clothes, a flashlight, a few batteries, a knife, some snacks, and a cooler full of frozen meals. I also brought my camping stove, even though the cabin had a small kitchen. I didn't trust old appliances in isolated places. I had been on a few solo trips before, mostly hiking, so I knew the importance of being prepared. The drive out was beautiful. Long roads winding through trees, leaves already changing color. By the time I reached the gravel road that led to the cabin, I hadn't seen another car for an hour. I followed the directions carefully, watching for the markers the owner had mentioned. A rusted mailbox, a wooden sign half covered in moss, a sharp turn near a tree shaped like a hook. After a few more minutes, I saw the cabin. It was small but well built. A single-story wooden structure with a front porch and a tin roof. The lake was about 50 yards away, and the water looked still and cold. There were trees on all sides, thick and tall, pressing in from every direction. I parked my car next to the porch and got out. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with a dusty couch, a coffee table, and a wood-burning stove. The kitchen had a sink, a tiny fridge, and a few cabinets. The bedroom had a full-sized bed, and the bathroom was just a toilet and a shower stall. Everything smelled old, but not dirty. It looked like no one had been there in a long time. I unpacked and put the cooler in the fridge. Then I walked around, making sure the doors and windows all closed properly. I checked for any signs of rodents or bugs. Nothing seemed out of place. It was quiet, too quiet almost. I could hear my own footsteps like they were echoing. The first day was peaceful. I sat by the lake, read a book, and made a small fire outside when the sun started to go down. There was no wind, and the flames crackled softly. I had my flashlight ready just in case, but I didn't need it right away. The sky turned orange, then purple, then black. I listened to the sounds of the woods, owls, frogs, and the occasional splash from the lake. I went inside when it got too cold. I locked the front door, shut all the windows, and got into bed. I had trouble sleeping, not because I was scared, but because it was so quiet. My ears kept picking up every little creak in the wood, every small pop of the cooling roof. I must have eventually dozed off because I woke up and it was morning. The second day, I decided to explore a bit. I took a walk through the woods using a compass and keeping track of where I came from. I found an old path, almost overgrown, that led deeper into the forest. I didn't follow it too far, just far enough to see that someone used to come this way often. There were stumps from old cut trees, a few rusted tools near a log, and even an old metal bucket hanging from a branch. It all looked abandoned. When I got back, I made lunch and sat on the porch. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, I saw a faint reflection, like light bouncing off something metallic, but there was no house or cabin on that side. It looked like trees for miles. I stood up and squinted. The reflection vanished. I chalked it up to the sun hitting the water just right, but something about it stayed in the back of my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep again. This time, it wasn't the silence. I kept feeling like I was being watched. I would open my eyes and stare at the window, even though it was shut and the curtain was pulled. I turned over, tried to relax, but my body felt tense. My ears strained for any noise that didn't belong. Then I heard a crack. It was soft like a stick snapping. I sat up. The cabin was dark, except for the faint light from the moon filtering in through the curtains. I held my breath. Another crack, this time closer. I got out of bed slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I stood near the window, pulling the curtain slightly aside. The trees looked normal. Nothing moved. I waited. Nothing. So I went back to bed. Next morning, I checked around the cabin. I found a few broken branches near the tree line, but that could have been from anything. Squirrels, deer, even the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Later that day, I heard something again. Not at night this time. It was around 3 p.m. I was inside, boiling water for coffee, when I heard a soft thud against the back wall. I froze. I waited to hear it again. Nothing. I walked slowly to the back window and looked out. Nothing there. I stepped outside, went around the cabin, and checked. I didn't see anything. No animals, no fallen branches, no signs that anything had hit the wall. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight next to me and slept in bursts. I would wake up sweating, heart racing, thinking I heard something moving outside. One time I thought I heard breathing right outside the bedroom window. Not wind, breathing, but I never saw anyone. Never found any footprints. Nothing. On the fourth morning, I made a decision. I was going to stay one more night and then leave early the next morning. I still had food and supplies, but my nerves were shot. I was tired, paranoid, and not enjoying the trip anymore. That afternoon, I saw the reflection again, across the lake in the same spot. But this time, it didn't vanish. It stayed, like someone holding something shiny just past the tree line. I stood up, went down to the water, and tried to get a better look. It disappeared again. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed on the couch, flashlight in hand, knife on the table, listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. Real footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Not the wind. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark. The footsteps moved around the cabin. One slow step at a time. Then they stopped. Right outside the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The porch creaked slightly, like someone shifting their weight. I sat there for what felt like hours. Eventually, the noise stopped. I waited even longer before I turned the flashlight back on. At dawn, I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. I got everything into the car, checked the tires, and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. Back home, I thought about reporting it. But what would I say? I never saw anyone. I never found proof. Just sounds, feelings, maybe a reflection. I left a short review on the cabin site, saying it was too remote for me and that I cut the trip short. That was all. Weeks went by. I tried to forget about it. Then one night I got curious. I checked the rental site again. The listing was gone. Not just unavailable, completely gone. I tried searching for the email I used to book. No response. Then I looked up the address on a map. Satellite view showed the lake, the trees, even the gravel road. But where the cabin should have been, there was nothing. Just woods. I don't know what I heard or saw out there. I don't know who or what was walking around that cabin at night. But I know what I felt. And I know I was being watched. I haven't gone on a solo trip since. I still camp sometimes, but only in places with other people around. And I never go without cell service. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that porch creak in my head. And I wonder if I left just in time. It was early September when I decided to take a week off and spend it alone in a small wooden cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. I'd been working back-to-back shifts at a warehouse for months and felt burned out. I didn't want to talk to anyone or hear the city noises anymore. I wanted complete silence, far away from traffic, people, phones, or screens. I booked the cabin online through a small listing site that specialized in remote vacation rentals. The photos were simple. Wooden siding, a tin roof, a stone chimney, and no neighbors in sight. It was exactly what I needed. The drive there took over 7 hours. I passed through small towns that got quieter and quieter the further north I went. Once I left the paved roads and followed the gravel path through thick pine and birch trees, I started to feel that strange kind of isolation that feels both peaceful and slightly uncomfortable. The kind where the air is so still that you start to hear your own heartbeat. The cabin sat at the end of the gravel road, right at the edge of a lake. The lake wasn't large, but it was long and narrow, surrounded on all sides by forest. No docks, no boats, no nearby homes. Just a stretch of dark water wrapped in trees. The sun was low when I arrived, casting a gold light across the lake that made the cabin look warmer than it felt. I parked beside a rusted propane tank and got out. The air was sharp and smelled of pine needles and damp soil. I walked up the 3 wooden steps and unlocked the front door using the code sent to my phone. Inside, everything was basic. A kitchen with old cabinets and a gas stove, a small table, a couch, and a single bedroom with a queen bed. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no service. A battery-powered radio sat on the windowsill. I liked that. I unpacked slowly, took a short walk down to the lake with my flashlight, and came back to make some simple food. That night, I lit the fireplace and sat on the floor next to it, staring into the flames until the heat made my skin tight. I felt calm. For the first time in months, I didn't feel surrounded by demands. There was nothing I had to do, That first night, I slept deeply and didn't wake up once. The next morning was overcast. I made instant coffee on the stove, then sat on the porch watching fog rise off the lake. Everything was completely still. Even the water didn't move. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through trees that didn't seem to move much at all. I felt a strange pressure in the air. Not a bad feeling, just heavy. I spent the day exploring the area. I followed deer trails through the trees and found an old wooden blind nailed high into a birch tree. It looked like no one had been up there in years. There were cans half buried in moss and what looked like an old, weather-beaten hunting knife stuck in a tree stump. I left it alone. Later that afternoon, I walked around the back of the cabin. I hadn't really looked at the structure closely yet. The siding was weathered and soft in places. Moss grew around the foundation. The stone chimney looked newer than the rest of the building. Then I noticed a second door on the back side of the cabin. It was strange because the listing only showed the front. This back door was smaller, made of thick vertical planks, and had a heavy latch with a rusted padlock on it. No windows, no handle, just that lock. I stared at it for a long time, felt out of place. There was no path to it, just weeds and uneven dirt. I crouched to look underneath, but saw only darkness between the floorboards. I figured maybe it was just a storage room, maybe where the propane was connected or an old root cellar sealed off. Still, something about it bothered me. I walked away and told myself not to think about it. That night, I built another fire and listened to the radio for a while. Static and distant voices faded in and out. It was too cloudy for stars, and I couldn't see the moon. I went to bed around 10 and fell asleep quickly again. But something woke me up just after 2 a.m. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up. I wasn't dreaming. I was just suddenly wide awake. I lay still and listened. The cabin creaked in the wind, which was normal. The trees outside groaned slightly, also normal. But then I heard a sound I couldn't place. A very low, dull thud. Not close, somewhere deeper in the cabin, like from behind a wall or below the floor. I sat up. The room was completely dark. I reached for my flashlight and shined it around. Everything looked untouched. I stood up, walked out to the small living room, checked the front door. It was still locked. I walked into the kitchen, looked at the small square window facing the trees. Nothing. Then I remembered the locked door at the back of the cabin. I opened the back curtains and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just the black shape of trees. But I stood there for a long time listening. First, nothing. Then again, asterisk thud star. A soft, slow sound. Then silence. I stared harder, my eyes adjusting to the dark. I could just barely see the outline of the back door and the lock. It looked undisturbed. Still, I grabbed a chair and shoved it under the front doorknob. Then I went back to bed and pulled the blanket over my head like a kid. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning was colder. I made coffee and walked around the cabin again. The back door still looked the same, padlock in place. I tried shaking it gently, but it didn't move. I even tried to pull it just to see if the wood had any give. Didn't. The door was solid. I told myself the sound had just been something shifting inside the walls. Old cabins do that. The night messes with your head. But that feeling stayed with me all day. Over the next 2 days, I tried to relax. I read a book I brought. I hiked a little further along the lake. I took some pictures of strange mushrooms growing on tree trunks. But the cabin didn't feel the same. At night, I heard sounds again. Sometimes faint creaking beneath the floor. Sometimes nothing at all. But the silence had changed. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something was waiting. On the 5th day, I found something I hadn't noticed before. I was sweeping some dead leaves off the porch and walked around to the back of the cabin again, mostly out of habit. But this time, I noticed a small, square patch of disturbed dirt just a few feet away from the locked door. It wasn't recent, but it was clear something had been buried or dug up there not long ago. The leaves over it were thinner. The soil was uneven and darker. I stared at it for a long time. Then I went inside and grabbed the fireplace poker. I returned to the spot and knelt down. The dirt was soft. I jabbed the poker into it and felt resistance maybe 6 inches down. Something solid. I dug with my hands, pulling clumps of earth aside. Eventually, I uncovered a large flat metal object. I brushed off more dirt and saw what looked like a rusted metal lid with a handle. Like a hatch. There was no lock on it, just rust. I didn't open it. I covered it back up with the same soil, pushed leaves over it, and walked back into the cabin. I felt like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. I didn't want to know what was beneath it. That night, the wind picked up. Trees cracked in the distance. I tried to sleep early, but I couldn't. Just past midnight, the sounds came again. This time, they weren't dull. They were sharp. I heard wood flexing, then something like metal scraping. I lay in bed, frozen. It wasn't the trees. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I turned on the flashlight and walked to the back window. I stood in the dark and looked out. The padlock was still on the door, but it looked different. It was hanging open. I stood there, gripping the flashlight. My whole body was tense. I told myself maybe it had just rusted through and fallen loose. Maybe the wind had pulled it free, but I hadn't heard anything fall. And the door was now cracked slightly open, less than an inch, but open. I didn't sleep again. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed everything: food, clothes, flashlight, batteries, first aid kit. I loaded it all into the truck. I took one last look at the cabin, then forced myself to walk to the back. The padlock was lying in the dirt. The door was now open wider, maybe 4 inches. The gap was dark inside. I knelt and shined my flashlight into it. I saw only a narrow staircase going down. Wooden steps. The walls were close and made of cement. It smelled like damp mold. I didn't go down. I closed the door, picked up the padlock, and tried to latch it again. But the latch was bent now, like it had been forced open from the inside. I got in my truck and left. On the way out, I stopped at the nearest gas station, which was about 45 minutes away. I told the man at the counter there was a problem with the cabin I had rented, and I needed to report it. He asked what kind of problem. I didn't say much, just that something wasn't right. He looked at me, then said quietly, "That old place again? That stuck with me." When I got home, I didn't contact the rental site. I didn't leave a review. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen, but I kept checking the listing for the cabin every few weeks. After about a month, it disappeared. Months later, I read a short news article buried online. It started with a need to get away from the city. Everything felt too loud, too fast, and too cramped. I'd been working back-to-back shifts at a warehouse just outside of town, and the noise never stopped. Machines, forklifts, people talking, yelling, phones ringing. My head throbbed every night. So, when I found an old listing online for a cheap cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho, I booked it immediately. The pictures didn't show much. Just a small one-story wooden cabin with a tin roof and a big front porch. It looked run down but quiet, surrounded by nothing but trees. The listing said it had no Wi-Fi and spotty cell service. That was perfect. I wasn't going to stream anything. I just wanted to sit in silence for a few days, maybe read, hike a little, eat, and sleep. I drove up on a Thursday. The roads narrowed the farther north I went. Pavement turned to gravel, then dirt. My old Honda rattled like it was falling apart, but it got me there. The last mile was barely a road, just a narrow path carved between trees with tire tracks as a guide. When I finally reached the cabin, I killed the engine and stepped out. It was quiet, really quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No cars, no voices, no hum of city life. Just trees rustling in the wind and the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere deep in the woods. The cabin sat on a small clearing, maybe 30 feet wide, before the forest swallowed everything up again. The wood was aged gray, probably hadn't been painted or sealed in decades. There was a small outhouse about 20 yards behind it and a rain barrel off the back corner. Inside, the place was bare bones. One small room with a twin bed, a wood-burning stove, and a table with 2 chairs. There was a cooler someone had left behind, empty. A few shelves held canned food, some of it probably expired. A hunting knife stuck in the wall beside the stove looked like it had been there for years. There were cobwebs in the corners, but it wasn't filthy. Just old. Lived in. Abandoned. I spent the first night reading on the porch until it got too dark to see. The trees swayed in the wind, casting long shadows across the clearing. I didn't bring much. Just a backpack with clothes, a flashlight, some bottled water, and a couple of freeze-dried meals. I laid down early and listened to the creaks in the walls, the soft tapping of tree branches outside. The next day I hiked. There wasn't a trail, so I just picked a direction and walked. The trees were thick, and the undergrowth made it slow going. I left broken twigs as markers and checked my compass often. I didn't go too far, just far enough to feel like I was truly alone. A stream ran maybe half a mile north, so I filled a small bottle there, filtered it, and drank. When I came back in the afternoon, I found deer tracks near the cabin. On the second night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just something different, like dry leaves moving around in short bursts. I sat up in bed and waited. It stopped. I figured it was some small animal, maybe a raccoon or a rabbit. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I saw boot prints outside the cabin. They weren't mine. Mine were deep and worn down from the same path, coming from and going to the front porch. These were fresher, lighter, and came in from the side of the trees. They stopped right outside the front window, turned around, and disappeared back into the woods. I crouched by them and stared at them for a long time. I kept telling myself it was probably a hiker, someone exploring the woods, maybe a hunter, maybe even someone who used to live in the cabin, checking on it. But they didn't knock. They didn't say anything. They just came close enough to look in the window, then left. I stayed near the cabin that day. I didn't hike. I collected some firewood, sharpened a stick just in case, and kept the hunting knife with me. I kept checking the woods, listening for anything. When night came, I locked the door, though the lock was just a sliding bolt, and kept the flashlight next to me in bed. Around midnight, I heard the same leaf-crunching sound. It was more drawn out this time, like someone walking slowly in a circle around the cabin. I didn't move. I kept still and just listened. Then it stopped again. Morning came. This time there were two sets of prints. One came from the north, the other from the west. Both sets walked up to the cabin, circled it, then returned into the woods. I could feel my stomach turn. My chest tightened. This wasn't random. Whoever they were watching. I was sure of it. I thought about leaving, but the drive back through the rough trail would take time, and I wasn't sure if they were still out there, watching from the trees. Instead, I spent the whole day boarding up the windows with what little I had. Some loose wood from behind the cabin, extra pieces from a half-rotten table, even a piece of the old porch railing. I pushed the table against the door and kept the knife in my hand all night. It rained that night. I could hear it tapping against the tin roof, the kind of steady rain that keeps you awake. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the dark ceiling and listened. A few times I thought I heard movement outside, but it was hard to tell with the rain. Then, just before dawn, I heard a different sound. 3 knocks, soft but clear, right on the wooden door. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The knocks didn't come again. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind and the dripping rain. When the sun came up, I opened the door slowly. The knife shook in my hand. No one was there, but at the foot of the steps, something had been left behind. A small dead bird, laid neatly on a flat rock. I packed my things that morning. I didn't eat. I didn't think. I just threw everything into my backpack, grabbed the knife, and got in the car. The drive back down that trail felt twice as long. Every branch that scraped the side of the car made me jump. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected someone to be standing in the trees. I made it to the nearest town before noon. I stopped at a gas station and just sat there for a long time, engine off, doors locked. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That someone knocked on a cabin door and left footprints? That someone left a bird on a rock? I went home. I didn't tell anyone, but I haven't slept well since. I keep a knife by my bed now. I check the windows before I sleep. I don't go camping anymore, and sometimes In the middle of the night, I think I hear those same soft knocks. Not loud, just soft, like someone doesn't want to wake me, just wants to see if I'm still there. But I don't open the door. Not anymore. I never will again. It was late September when I decided to take some time off work and head into the mountains. I had been working nonstop for months, barely taking a weekend off, and the stress had been building. I didn't want anything fancy, just peace, some silence, a place with no signal, and a chance to reset. I booked a small cabin I found online, hidden deep in the forest near the edge of a mountain range about 4 hours from home. It looked old and worn down, but it had the basics. A bed, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with running water. That's all I needed. I left early in the morning, driving through towns that got smaller and smaller until I was following dirt roads. The last stretch was narrow and rough. The trees grew so thick on both sides that I had to keep my headlights on, even though it was still daytime. The GPS lost signal about 10 miles before I got to the cabin. I kept going, trusting the printed directions I had brought as backup. After what felt like forever, I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a tree with the name of the cabin scratched into it. I turned left onto a thin trail and drove another half-mile until the cabin came into view. It sat alone in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. The structure leaned slightly to one side. The wood was faded, and the porch steps looked like they might break if I stepped too hard. Still, it had charm in a quiet way. I parked the car off to the side and got out. The air smelled clean and cold. I took a few deep breaths and stood there for a while, letting the quiet settle over me. No engines, no voices, just birds and the wind moving through the trees. I carried my bags inside. The cabin was small but warmer than it looked. There was a single bed against the wall, a small couch, and a wood stove in the corner with a neat pile of chopped wood beside it. The kitchen was a simple counter with a sink and a 2-burner stove. The bathroom was tucked in the back, tiny but functional. There was even a small shelf with a few books and board games, probably left by previous guests. That first day passed without anything strange. I went for a short walk, staying close to the cabin. I unpacked, cooked a quick dinner, and lit a fire in the stove when the temperature dropped in the evening. I read for a while and then went to bed early. I slept surprisingly well. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. I made coffee on the stove, ate a granola bar, and took another walk, going a bit further this time. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin that led downhill through thick trees. After about an hour, I came to a stream. The water was clear and fast-moving. I sat on a rock beside it for a long time, just listening. Everything felt calm. I didn't see another person all day. That night, as I was chopping some wood behind the cabin, I heard something in the trees. It was quick, just a snap of a branch and a rustle, but enough to make me stop. I stood still, holding the axe and listening. Nothing followed. Could have been an animal. I finished chopping and went inside. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the air was cold. I sat up and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then, there was a sound outside. Not close, but clear, like someone walking in dry leaves. The steps were slow and uneven, dragging in a strange way. I froze. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I waited, heart pounding. The steps stopped after a while. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked around the clearing. I didn't see anything out of place. No footprints, no broken branches. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a deer. Maybe my mind playing tricks in the middle of the night. The next couple of days were mostly normal. I hiked, cooked, read, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Once, while walking along the stream, I saw something across the water. It was a flash of movement, maybe a figure. I stood there, staring across the stream, but saw nothing more. I turned around and walked back faster than usual. Another night, I heard knocking. 3 short knocks, like someone tapping wood. It came from behind the cabin, near the woodshed. I got out of bed and went to the window, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I didn't go outside. I just sat there, waiting. The knocking didn't return. I started checking the doors and windows twice before bed. I kept the axe inside at night. I didn't have any weapons besides that. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I felt watched. On the 5th night, it got worse. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard breathing. Not mine. It was faint but steady, coming from the other side of the wall. I held my breath and listened, kept going. A low, slow inhale and exhale. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. I never heard footsteps, never saw anything move, just that sound. It stopped just before sunrise. That morning, I packed my things. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I'd only planned to stay one more night, but I didn't care. I wanted out. I loaded everything into the car and went back inside to clean up. I didn't want to leave a mess. That's when I noticed the back door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I always did. I stood there staring at the handle. It didn't look broken or damaged, just unlocked. I checked the rest of the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. But that didn't make me feel better. It made it worse. I drove out fast. The narrow road felt even longer on the way back. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. But the road stayed empty. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. Just said the place was too quiet, that I couldn't sleep well, that I wanted to come back early. But I thought about it every night. A week later, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was gone. The whole page had been taken down. No pictures, no reviews, nothing. Like it had never existed. I even tried calling the number from the confirmation email, but it was out of service. I still don't know what happened up there. I never saw a face, never found proof of anyone else. But I know what I heard, and I know what I felt. Something was out there. Something was near that cabin every night, watching, waiting. It didn't try to break in. It didn't want to hurt me, not yet. But I think if I had stayed one more night, it would have come inside. That thought still keeps me awake sometimes, and I haven't gone back into the woods since. It started as a last-minute trip. I had some time off work and wanted to spend it alone, somewhere quiet. I found an old cabin listed on a forum where people shared hidden getaways. It wasn't on any big booking site, just a few grainy pictures, a rough description, and a note that said, "Perfect for solitude." That was all I needed. I didn't ask many questions. The cabin was deep in the forests of northern Idaho, down a gravel road that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My old truck barely made it through the potholes and mud, and I had to stop a few times to clear branches from the path. The trees closed in around me the further I went, the forest thick and quiet. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was small, made of dark wood, with a sagging roof and a narrow porch. There were no neighbors, no cell signal, no electricity. It had a wood stove, an outhouse out back, and a hand pump for water. Exactly what I was looking for. I unpacked slowly. One duffel bag of clothes, a cooler of food, a flashlight, a knife, a first aid kit, and a pile of books. I set up my sleeping bag on the old cot inside, then started a fire in the stove. The cabin creaked as it warmed up, the wood expanding after probably sitting cold for weeks, or months. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. No traffic, no voices, no buzzing lights, just the sound of nature. I went to sleep early, the kind of deep sleep that only happens when you feel completely alone. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a loud thump outside. It was solid, like something heavy landing on the porch. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. Nothing else happened. I figured it might have been a branch falling from a tree or a raccoon knocking something over. I didn't even get up to check. The next morning, I found a deep scratch across the door. 3 lines, jagged and uneven, cut into the wood. It looked fresh. I stood there for a while, trying to figure it out. No animal I knew of could make marks like that without leaving tracks. But there were no footprints, No sign of anything. I told myself the wood was just old and maybe splitting. I moved on. I spent most of the second day exploring the woods around the cabin. I didn't go far, just far enough to stretch my legs and clear my mind. I found an old trail behind the outhouse, overgrown but still visible. It led uphill, winding between thick pines and moss-covered rocks. I followed it for maybe an hour before turning back. I didn't bring my phone, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. That night, I locked the cabin door. There was no real lock, just a wooden bar that fit across the inside. I placed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I fell asleep listening to the fire crackle. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that got me. It was silence, total silence. No wind, no bugs, nothing. Just a stillness that made my ears ring. I waited, then I heard it. Slow footsteps moving across the porch. One step, then another. The boards creaked under the weight. It was steady, unhurried. I held my breath. The steps stopped right in front of the door. I could hear something breathing. It wasn't animal-like. It was steady, slow, and deep. I didn't move. My flashlight was in my bag across the room. I stayed frozen on the cot, hoping whatever it was would go away. After a while, the steps moved again, circling the cabin. Then they stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I watched the door until the sky started turning gray. When it was light enough to see, I went outside. There were no footprints. The ground was hard, and the grass was tall, but I checked all around. Nothing. The only thing new was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly beside the porch. I hadn't seen them before. It was like a little cairn. 5 stones, stacked carefully, balanced perfectly. I didn't like it. I pushed the stack over with my boot and went back inside. On the third day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the fire going and checked the area every hour. There was no one around. No animals. No sound. Even the birds were gone. I started to feel like I was being watched. I'd catch myself staring out the window, expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, but no one ever was. Later that evening, I heard something hit the roof. A soft thump like something small landing up there. Then another, and another. I went outside and saw rocks. Dozens of small rocks, scattered across the clearing. Some were still rolling off the roof. I looked up, but the trees were too dense to see anything. I picked up one of the rocks. It had a symbol scratched into it. A spiral, crude and shallow, like it had been done with a nail. I went back inside and blocked the door again. That night was worse. I didn't sleep. The sound of footsteps came again, but this time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin again and again. Then tapping started. Light, careful tapping on the windows, like fingers. I stayed in the corner, holding my knife, heart racing. The fire died out and the room went cold. The tapping moved from window to window, slow and steady. Then it stopped. Just before dawn, I heard whispering outside. Not words, just sounds. Low, breathy murmurs. I didn't move until it was light. When I finally stepped outside, I found more stacked rocks. 2 piles this time. One by the steps. One on the wood pile. More spirals. I kicked them down and grabbed my bag. I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything and left the cabin just after noon. I didn't even bother locking the door. I threw my gear in the truck and started back down the trail, bumping over roots and rocks as fast as I could. But something was wrong. After 20 minutes, I came to a bend in the road I didn't recognize. I checked the GPS, but there was no signal. I kept going. Then I passed the cabin again. I had looped back somehow. I stopped the truck and got out. I looked around carefully. I hadn't turned. There were no side roads, no other paths, but somehow I had driven in a full circle. I tried again. This time, I went slower, trying to retrace the route I remembered. I even marked trees with orange tape I had in the glove box. But again, I looped back. The cabin stood there, dark and quiet, like it was waiting. I stayed in the truck that night. I locked the doors and kept the knife close. I left the windows cracked so I could hear. The forest stayed silent until around 2 a.m. Then came the footsteps. This time, more than one set, at least three, moving through the trees, coming from different directions. The whispering started again, louder, closer, then a knock on the window, just once. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. I stayed completely still. They moved around the truck for hours. Light touches, dragging fingers, a tapping on the roof. Then, as the sun began to rise, it all stopped. I tried leaving again at first light. This time, I drove straight through the forest. I didn't follow the road. I aimed the truck downhill, bouncing over rocks and crushing bushes. The forest was thick, and I was terrified of hitting a tree, but I didn't care. After an hour of slow, brutal driving, I broke through the trees onto a narrow paved road. I didn't know where I was, but I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached a gas station. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not then. Not for a long time. A few months later, I looked up the forum where I found the cabin listing. It was gone. Deleted. The user who posted it had no other history. I checked maps, tried to locate the cabin again, but I never found it. It was like the place never existed. I still don't know who was out there or why they did what they did. It wasn't animals, and it wasn't some ghost story. It was real people. People who knew the forest better than I did. People who didn't want me there. I never go anywhere without telling someone now. I always carry 2 phones, and I don't stay in cabins anymore. Not alone. That trip changed me. Not because I was hurt, not because I saw something I couldn't explain, but because of how real it was, how quiet, how patient they were, how close they got, and how, to this day, I never saw a single face. It started as a quiet weekend trip. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forest about 4 hours outside the city. I found it online through a listing someone had posted on a local forum. It wasn't part of a resort or some campground. It looked like it used to be someone's hunting cabin a long time ago. The photos showed it was run down but still standing strong. It had everything I needed. For solid walls, a roof, and enough space for one person. I didn't need much more than that. I had been working non-stop for months and felt like I was about to burn out. I needed a break, some time alone, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could turn off my phone, sleep as much as I wanted, and maybe go for some walks. No traffic, no notifications, no small talk. Just me, the trees, and silence. The drive up there was long but smooth. Most of it was paved roads, but the last hour was a dirt road through thick forest. The trees were tall and close together, and the deeper I drove, the darker it got. The road was bumpy, with roots and rocks pushing up from the dirt, and I had to take it slow. I had filled up on gas earlier and packed all the food and water I needed for the weekend. I brought a flashlight, an old hunting knife, and a folding chair. I even packed a few books. I got there just before sunset. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine and spruce trees. The windows were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the wooden steps creaked under my weight. There was a small front porch with a rusty chair, and inside, the place was one room. It had a small cot, a table with one chair, a wood stove, and a shelf nailed to the wall with a few old cans and a lantern. I checked everything. The windows shut properly. The door locked. The roof didn't leak. There was even a small outdoor toilet about 30 feet out back. I unpacked my bag and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I didn't plan to do much that night, so I heated a can of soup on my portable stove and ate quietly while the sky went from orange to dark blue. After eating, I sat outside for a bit. It was completely silent except for the wind moving through the trees. No sounds of cars or people, just the forest. I liked it. That first night, I slept well. It took a while to get used to the total darkness. I had brought a battery-powered lamp and kept it on low just in case. I woke up once to the sound of something scratching the wall, but it was probably just a raccoon or a branch. I didn't even get out of bed. I turned over and went back to sleep. The next day, I spent most of the morning walking. There were no marked trails, but I had downloaded an offline map and made sure to stick close to my cabin. I found a small stream, saw deer tracks, and even spotted a fox. Around noon, I came back and made lunch, then red for a bit. Everything felt fine. I had no signal, and I liked that. I didn't check my phone once. That afternoon, I noticed something weird. It was small at first. I had left my folding chair on the porch, but when I got back from a short walk, it was leaning against the wall instead of being open where I left it. I figured the wind might have knocked it over, but there wasn't much wind that day. That night, I heard more noises, scratching again, this time from the back wall. I got up and shone my flashlight around outside, but I didn't see anything. No tracks, no signs of animals. I shut the door tighter and placed a heavy can on top of it as an extra lock. By the third day, I felt a little off, like I was being watched. I know that sounds like paranoia, but something had changed. I wasn't as relaxed as before. I kept hearing little things, twigs snapping, the sound of movement in the brush. Not animals. I've been camping before. I know what deer or squirrels sound like. This was different, quieter, slower, like someone trying not to be heard. I walked farther that day, trying to clear my head. I found a fallen tree and sat there for a while, listening to the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I ended up turning back early. That evening, I double-checked the door and windows. I even blocked the inside of the door with my cooler. It rained that night, not heavy, just a steady drizzle. I stayed inside, reading and eating trail mix. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside. It wasn't just scratching. It was footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps moving around the cabin. I held my breath and turned off the lamp. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The footsteps circled the cabin once, maybe twice, then stopped. I sat there in the dark, holding the hunting knife. I didn't sleep at all. When the sky finally started to lighten, I opened the door and looked around. Nothing. No one. No footprints either, which was strange. The ground was damp from the rain. If someone had been walking around, they should have left tracks. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. Maybe an animal. But it didn't feel like that. Something was off. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up everything that morning. My bag was already loaded when I noticed something else. There was a mark on the back wall. A scratch mark, long and deep, like someone had dragged a metal object along the wood. It wasn't there before. I didn't waste time. I got in my car and started driving back down the dirt road. It had rained most of the night, so the road was muddy. My tires slipped a few times, but I didn't stop. About 20 minutes into the drive, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing in the trees, not moving, just watching. I hit the gas. My heart was pounding again, and I gripped the wheel tighter. I didn't look back again until I hit the paved road. I made it home by evening. I was still shaking when I got out of the car. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. What would I even say? That someone followed me into the woods? That they stood outside my cabin in the rain and scratched the walls? A few weeks passed. I tried to forget about it. But one morning, I found something under the mat by my front door. It was a small piece of wood, old, chipped, with a mark carved into it. The same kind of scratch I saw on the cabin wall. I moved out of that apartment a week later. I changed my number. I haven't gone camping since. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know it wasn't an animal. Someone was watching me that weekend. Someone was near my cabin, close enough to touch the walls. And whoever it was, they followed me home. It was late September when I decided to head up to the woods in Vermont. I had some time off work and wanted a break from the noise of the city. I found a listing for a small, remote cabin deep in the forest, about an hour's drive from any town. It was advertised as a hunter's cabin. No internet, no cell signal, just peace and quiet. I packed a cooler with enough food for a week, threw in a bunch of canned stuff and dry food too, filled my car with gas, and headed out early on a Monday morning. The drive up was beautiful. The leaves were already changing, with reds and yellows filling the trees. I had a full thermos of coffee and some music playing. After about 4 hours, I turned off the main road onto a long, winding dirt path. There were no houses, no stores, nothing, just woods. The cabin was at the very end of that dirt road, tucked between tall trees, barely visible from the path. It was a small place, just one main room with a bed, a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a small bathroom with a toilet and a sink. No shower. There was a shed outside with chopped wood and some tools. I brought my own water jugs, since the sink worked off a rain barrel that didn't look very clean. There was a little clearing around the cabin, but nothing else. No nearby cabins, no trails, just forest. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I slept in, made simple meals, read books, and sat outside with my coffee listening to birds and the wind in the trees. I didn't see a single person. I didn't expect to. That's why I picked the place. On the 3rd day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I didn't go far. I wasn't stupid. I had a compass, and I marked the cabin's direction in my notebook. I wandered maybe 20 minutes out and then back. It was peaceful. The forest felt untouched. But as I came back, I noticed something strange. On a tree about 15 feet from the cabin, there were scratches, deep ones in 3 straight lines, like a big animal had raked its claws across the bark. I figured it might have been a bear or something. I didn't overthink it. There are animals in the woods, after all. That night, it rained hard. I could hear it hitting the tin roof. I had the wood stove going, and it was warm inside. I sat up reading until late, and eventually fell asleep with the rain still coming down. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The rain had stopped. It was quiet, but not peaceful. Felt like the air had changed. I lay there listening. First, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, I heard a creaking sound, like wood shifting. It was slow and steady. I thought it was the cabin settling after the rain. But then I heard a crunch, like a footstep, on wet leaves. I stayed still. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the sound came again, closer this time. Another crunch, then another. I slid out of bed quietly and moved to the window. I couldn't see anything at first, just the darkness and the trees. I had a flashlight but didn't want to use it yet. Then, right at the edge of the clearing, I saw something, a shape. It was a man, I think, standing very still between the trees, just barely visible. No light, no movement, just standing there. I backed away from the window. My heart was pounding. I didn't know what to do. I had no phone signal. The nearest house was miles away. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was staying. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the chair by the stove with a hatchet I found in the shed. I waited until the sun came up. When it did, I went out and looked. There were no footprints that I could see, but the ground was still wet. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a shadow. But later that day, I found something that told me I hadn't imagined anything. Behind the shed, on the ground, I found a piece of cloth, like part of a jacket. It was snagged on a branch, dark blue or black. I hadn't worn anything like that. It hadn't been there before. I didn't feel safe anymore. I thought about leaving, but I had already paid for the week. I tried to convince myself it was probably a hunter who got turned around in the woods. Maybe he didn't know the cabin was rented. Still, I started locking the door even in the daytime. I kept the hatchet close. I double-checked all the windows. The 5th night was worse. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a sound like tapping. Light and quick on the window beside the bed. My eyes shot open. I didn't move. The tapping came again. A soft, irregular pattern, like someone using their fingernail. I rolled slowly out of bed and crouched down low. I peeked up at the window. There was a face, pressed against the glass, just barely visible. No expression, just watching. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just froze. I waited. After maybe 20 seconds, the face pulled away and vanished into the darkness. I sat on the floor with the hatchet in my lap for hours. I didn't dare look out again. I waited until daylight. When it finally came, I rushed outside. There were footprints in the dirt, clear ones, boot prints. They went around the cabin, back and forth. They circled it more than once. Someone had been walking around out there while I was asleep. I decided to leave. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I threw it all in the back of the car and started driving down that long dirt road. I didn't look back. I kept the doors locked and didn't stop until I reached the highway. At a gas station, I called the owner of the cabin from a payphone. I told him what happened. He didn't say much, just said no one was supposed to be anywhere near there. Said he'd go up and check it out. I never heard back from him. A few weeks later, I saw a news story online. A body had been found in those woods, not far from the cabin. A hiker, they said. No ID, no cause of death listed. Just a man in a dark blue jacket. I never went back to the woods again. It started when I took time off work in early October. I needed to get away from everything. My phone, the city, the noise, and especially people. My job in IT had been burning me out, and the apartment I lived in was just another tight box stacked on top of 100 others. Every day felt like a repeat. I wanted something different, quiet, alone. I found a listing online for a cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. It wasn't part of a resort. It wasn't a tourist spot. It was just an old wooden cabin, a little worn down, nestled deep in the forest, available to rent through a small website that catered to solo hikers, hunters, and off-grid travelers. It had a wood stove, a bed, some basic kitchen gear, and solar-powered lights. No internet, no cell service. That was exactly what I needed. The drive from Spokane took me about 4.5 hours. The last hour was on dirt roads that looked more like dry stream beds than actual roads. Potholes the size of bathtubs slowed me down to a crawl. The trees pressed in on both sides, and I didn't see a single car or person for miles. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost dusk. The sky had that cold, pinkish hue, and the wind was starting to pick up. The cabin looked older than the photos showed. The logs were dark with age, and the roof sagged just slightly in the middle. There was a shed about 10 yards behind it and an outhouse off to the side, maybe 50 feet from the door. The forest behind the cabin was thick and uneven, all firs and underbrush. I got out, stretched, and the quiet hit me hard.
No engines, no voices.
No buzzing from phone notifications. Just the wind moving through trees and a few birds somewhere far off. It was perfect. I unloaded my gear, mostly just clothes, canned food, water, a good flashlight, and a few basic tools. I made a quick dinner on the propane burner inside, sat on the porch, and just watched the light fade. That first night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The first few days went by peacefully. I explored a little during the day, hiked up the nearby ridge, took a lot of photos of the leaves turning yellow and orange. The nights were cold, so I kept the fire going in the wood stove. The place creaked in the wind, but it didn't bother me. I was too tired to care. I had a notebook with me and started writing down thoughts and sketches. I didn't bring books or music or anything that could distract me. It felt good to disconnect. Every day was quiet, just me and the woods. But by the fourth day, I started feeling like something was off. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a small sense that I wasn't really alone. The kind of feeling you get when you think someone's behind you, but you turn and there's nothing there. It was subtle. I'd be sitting outside in the early evening, and I'd think I heard something. A footstep, a branch cracking, not close but not far either. I told myself it was animals. Deer, squirrels, bears maybe. It was the woods. Of course there would be noises. The next morning, I found something strange near the fire pit. A small pile of rocks had been stacked into a neat little tower. 5 or 6 stones, balanced on top of each other in a way that seemed too deliberate. I hadn't done it. I hadn't even used the fire pit yet. I crouched down and looked at it. It wasn't just a random pile. Someone made it. I knocked it over and brushed it away. I spent most of that day walking further out. I wanted to get to the stream I had seen on the map. It was about 2 miles downhill. I took my small day pack, some snacks and water, and set out around mid-morning. The trail was rough, and I had to push through some thick brush in places. When I finally reached the stream, I sat on a rock and let the cold water run over my hands. It felt good, calming. I ate, rested, and headed back. I got back to the cabin just before sunset. As I came up the path, I stopped. There were more rock piles. 3 of them. One on the front porch, one by the fire pit again, and another beside the shed. They were different sizes and shapes. None of them were there when I left. I stared at them for a while, trying to figure out if I was being messed with. Maybe a hunter nearby, or another hiker. But I hadn't seen a single person, not even a footprint on the trails. It didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside. Not animals. Heavier. Slower. I would sit up in bed and shine my flashlight out the window, but the beam only lit up the trees a few feet away. Everything beyond that was just black. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but when I aimed the light, nothing was there. The cabin walls were thin. Every sound outside felt like it was inches away. In the morning, I walked the perimeter.
No footprints.
No sign of anyone. The rock piles were gone. I looked for drag marks or signs they were kicked over, but it was like they had never been there. I stood there for a while, staring at the spot on the porch. I felt cold, even though the sun was out. I thought about leaving. I packed my gear, threw it in the back of the SUV, and sat in the driver's seat with the keys in my hand. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to believe someone was out there messing with me. I told myself I was overthinking it. Just tired, paranoid. I unpacked and stayed. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I kept checking over my shoulder. I walked out a little ways into the woods and circled the place, looking for signs of anyone. I didn't find anything.
No trash. No boot prints.
Nothing. I started wondering if I had stacked those rocks myself and forgot. But that didn't feel right either. That night, it got worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a loud bang, like something hitting the side of the cabin. Then nothing. I sat up, heart racing, and just listened. The wind had died. It was dead quiet. I reached for my flashlight and moved to the window. I saw movement again, just on the edge of the tree line. Person. They were standing completely still, facing the cabin. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a man. I froze. The flashlight beam barely reached them, but they didn't move. I stared at them for maybe 10 seconds. Then they turned and walked away slowly into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner with the hatchet I kept by the stove, just staring at the windows, waiting. Nothing else happened, but I felt like the whole place was being watched. In the morning, I walked out there. I found no prints, no broken branches, no proof. I packed my things again, threw them in the car, but this time I didn't hesitate. I was leaving. I started driving, but about 20 minutes down the dirt road, I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the road. A thick, dead pine, right across the middle of the path. It hadn't been there when I drove in. I got out and walked up to it. The cut looked fresh, clean, like it was done with a saw. Not wind damage, not rot. Someone had cut it and pushed it across the road. I didn't have the tools to move it. It was too heavy. I turned around and drove back to the cabin. I felt trapped. I knew I couldn't walk to town. It was too far. No phone signal, no radio. I had food and water for a few more days, so I locked the doors and stayed inside. That night, they came back. I don't know how many. I heard them outside. More than one set of footsteps. They circled the cabin, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. I could hear them breathing. At one point, something scraped against the side of the cabin, long and slow like a branch or a knife. I didn't go near the windows. I just sat there, holding the hatchet, trying not to breathe too loud. By morning, they were gone, but I found more piles. Not just rocks this time, bones, small animal bones, arranged in patterns outside the front door. A dead bird nailed to the shed door. I didn't even touch it. I backed away and sat inside, shaking. I kept the fire going, but it didn't help. The heat didn't cut through the fear. The next day, I waited until noon and walked back down to the road, just in case. When I reached the fallen tree, it was gone, completely gone, no trace of it. I stared at the empty road for a long time. I got back in the SUV and drove. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached the highway and didn't breathe easy until I saw the lights of a gas station. I told myself I was never going back to the woods alone again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. What would I say? That someone or several people followed me out there and played games with me? That they watched me? Left me messages in piles of rocks and bones? There's no way to explain that without sounding crazy. It's been months now. I'm back at work, back in the city. Life feels normal again. But every now and then, I wake up at night and think I hear that scraping sound. Long and slow, across the wall. I get up and check every window, every door. Everything's always locked. No one's ever there. But the fear never really left. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a break from the constant noise of the city. I had been working long hours, barely getting sleep, and most of my days blurred together. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone with no distractions. So, I rented a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was about 2 hours from the nearest town and had no internet, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. The ad said it was once used as a fire lookout post before being converted into a rental cabin. That sounded perfect to me. I drove up on a Wednesday morning. The sky was mostly clear, and the leaves were just starting to turn shades of orange and red. I followed the directions I'd printed out since GPS would be useless that far into the forest. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then from gravel to dirt, and eventually I was on a narrow, overgrown trail that barely looked like a road at all. Branches scraped the sides of my SUV as I crawled up the path, bouncing slowly over rocks and potholes. Just when I started to wonder if I had made a mistake, I saw the edge of the cabin roof poke out from behind the trees. The place was simple. It was a one-story wooden cabin with a tin roof and a wide porch that overlooked the slope of a hill. There were 2 rocking chairs, an old woodpile, and a rusted axe leaning against the side. The key had been left in a lockbox on the front door, and when I opened it up, I could still smell the scent of old pine and smoke. Inside, the furniture was old but clean: wooden table, 2 chairs, a small couch, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a queen-sized bed in the only bedroom. The bathroom had running water from a well pump and a gas water heater. The kitchen had a propane-powered fridge and stove, and the cabinets were stocked with basics like canned soup, beans, rice, and instant coffee. I unpacked, made a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch. The silence out there was complete. No cars, no people, just the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. I planned to stay 4 nights, from Wednesday through Sunday, just to clear my head. I brought some books, a journal, and a rifle in case I ran into wildlife. Felt safe. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili, read a little by lantern light, and went to bed early. It was colder than I expected, but there were enough blankets to keep warm. I slept deeply and woke up around 7 a.m. The air smelled fresh, and I boiled water for coffee while sitting on the porch again, wrapped in a heavy flannel blanket. That whole day I didn't do much. Mostly walked a few trails near the cabin, collected firewood, and just sat still. Felt like my mind was slowing down in a good way. But late that night, I started hearing things. I had just gone to bed and turned off the lantern when I heard a loud snap out in the trees. It wasn't just a small twig. It was the sound of something heavy stepping on a thick branch. I sat up in bed and listened. A few seconds later, another snap. Then silence. I waited, not moving, just listening. Eventually, I heard a faint rustle, like leaves being brushed aside. It was hard to tell how far away it was. I got up and grabbed my flashlight and rifle. I stepped out onto the porch and scanned the treeline. Nothing, just blackness and tall trees. I stood there for a long time until the cold made my fingers ache. I finally went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I went to look around where I thought the sound came from. There wasn't much to see, just fallen leaves and pine needles everywhere. But about 30 yards from the cabin, I found something strange. There were fresh boot prints in the soft earth. Not hiking boots like mine, these looked heavier, like work boots. They came from deeper in the forest, stopped near a tree, then turned back the way they came. I hadn't seen a single person since arriving, and I was too far from any other place for someone to just walk by randomly. I decided to hike a bit farther into the woods that day, following the general direction the prints had come from. After about an hour of walking, I came across an old hunting blind, just a rough platform tied into a tree. It looked abandoned. Underneath it were a few empty food wrappers and an old campfire ring, long cold. That made me uneasy. Someone had been out there recently. I headed back before the sun got low. That night, the sounds started again. More footsteps in the dark. Closer this time. I didn't go outside. I sat in the cabin with the lantern on and the rifle across my lap. My ears strained to pick up any little sound. At one point, I swore I heard something brush against the wall outside. A soft thud, then quiet. I stayed awake almost all night, finally falling asleep just before sunrise. On Friday morning, I made the decision to leave a day early. I didn't feel right staying there anymore. I packed most of my gear and kept just a few things out for the night. But when I tried to start the SUV, it didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I opened the hood and checked the terminals. They weren't corroded. I checked the cables, they were tight. I had no idea why it wouldn't start. It had been running perfectly the day before. With no cell service and no nearby neighbors, I realized I was stuck for at least one more night. I kept the doors locked and spent most of the afternoon chopping wood and staying close to the cabin. I didn't want to be caught off guard. That night was worse than the others. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy ones. Slow. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark with the rifle. Then the doorknob rattled. Just a little, like someone testing it. My breath caught in my throat. I aimed the rifle at the door and waited. The knob stopped moving. Then silence. No footsteps walking away. No sound at all. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked around. There were boot prints on the porch, deep ones. They led up to the door, then around the side of the cabin. I followed them to the back, but they stopped in the grass. Just ended. No return trail. I decided to hike back to the main road. I figured I'd walk until I got a signal or saw a car. It was a long shot, but better than staying another night. I left a note on the door saying I had gone to get help, just in case someone found the place. I packed my rifle, some food and water, and started walking. It took almost 6 hours to reach the gravel road. My legs were sore and I was exhausted. I finally got 1 bar of signal and called a tow truck. They said they'd be there in about 2 hours. While I waited, I sat on a log just off the road and watched the trees. It was strangely quiet again. The truck finally arrived, and we drove back to the cabin. The driver helped me jump the SUV. Started right away. We couldn't figure out what had happened. I loaded my things, thanked the driver, and left as fast as I could. I never found out who had been out there. The rental owner said no one else was supposed to be nearby. I didn't report it. I didn't want to deal with it. But I think about that cabin a lot now. About the boot prints, the sounds at night, the person who tried the door. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't anything paranormal. It was just someone out there, watching, waiting, and that's what scared me the most. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I needed to get away. I didn't have some big dramatic reason for it. No recent breakup, no fight, no job burnout. I just felt like I had been slowly suffocating in the routine of the city. The traffic, the noise, the same sidewalks every day, the same faces. My apartment walls had started to feel like they were closing in. So, I booked a week off, found a remote cabin listed online, and packed my car with basic gear. Some clothes, canned food, bottled water, and a couple of good books. I also threw in a hatchet and a survival knife, more out of habit than necessity. I had camped before, but this would be my first time staying completely alone in a cabin for more than a night or two. The cabin was about 4 hours north from where I lived, tucked away in a part of the forest I had never explored. The directions provided were simple. Take the highway until mile marker 146, then a narrow dirt road for 15 miles. took longer than I expected. The dirt road was in rough shape, and I had to go slow to avoid bottoming out my small SUV. There were no signs, no cell signal, and after a while, no indication that anyone had used the road in weeks. But eventually, I spotted the cabin through the trees. It was older than the pictures made it seem, but not in a way that bothered me. The wood was faded gray, the porch creaked, and the windows were streaked with dirt. But it was standing, the roof looked intact, and the door opened without a problem. Inside, it was one room, just a bed, a table, a wood stove, a shelf with a few dusty dishes, and a small kitchenette. No plumbing, no electricity, but that was expected. There was an outhouse about 20 feet into the woods, and a metal barrel for collecting rainwater. It was quiet. So quiet, in fact, that I noticed the silence more than the birds or wind. The first night was peaceful. I ate a simple meal, read for a bit, and lay in bed listening to the wind outside. The darkness was thick, thicker than I was used to. Without city lights, it felt like the darkness itself was pressing against the windows. I fell asleep with the feeling that the woods outside were watching, but it was just nerves. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a shallow creek about a 10-minute walk downhill, and some signs of old logging trails long overgrown. I followed one for a while but turned back when I realized I had no signal and hadn't brought my compass. That night, I noticed something odd. I had placed a folding chair outside on the porch, angled to watch the sunset through a gap in the trees. When I stepped outside after dark to get the chair, it wasn't where I left it. It was still on the porch, but facing the opposite direction, like someone had sat in it and turned it to look toward the cabin instead of the trees. I figured I must have moved it without thinking. Maybe I had sat in it earlier and forgot. On the third day, I woke up feeling uneasy. Couldn't place why. The cabin felt colder, like the temperature had dropped overnight. But when I stepped outside, the air was warm. I shook it off and went about the day. I chopped a little firewood, washed in the creek, and tried sketching the landscape. But I kept glancing toward the tree line. I didn't know why. It just felt like something was out there. That night, I double-checked the door lock. Even though the nearest person was probably 20 miles away, I kept the hatchet next to the bed. I told myself it was just caution. Nothing had happened, not really, but my sleep was shallow and broken. I kept waking up to faint noises, creaking, thumps, or what might have been footsteps outside. Every time I got up and checked, there was nothing, just trees and dark. On the fourth morning, I found tracks. They weren't animal prints. They were human, barefoot, leading from the edge of the woods around the side of the cabin and disappearing behind it. I followed them. They went toward the rain barrel, then back toward the woods. The prints were clear. Someone had walked up to the cabin and left. The tracks were dry, not fresh from that morning, but recent. I felt it in my stomach. My first thought was that someone had been watching me, maybe a hiker or someone squatting in the woods. I shouted once just in case. Nothing. I walked the perimeter for a while, then sat on the porch with the hatchet in my lap. That evening, I decided not to light a fire. I wanted to see if anyone would come closer if they thought I wasn't awake. I stayed inside, by the window, staring out at the forest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. I barely slept. The next morning, something had changed. A stick figure, one of those crude ones made by tying sticks together with twine, was hanging from the tree just beyond the porch. It hadn't been there the day before. The twine was thin and dirty. I checked the area for more prints, but the ground was too dry. I didn't touch the figure. I just stared at it for a long time. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being watched. I was being messed with. I considered leaving, but I had 3 more nights left, and something in me didn't want to be chased off by someone playing games. I started marking the time and logging everything. Noises, movements, any sign of change. I moved the chair back to its original spot and photographed it with my phone. The phone had no signal, but it could still take pictures. That night, I sat up again, staring at the woods. At 2:13 a.m., I heard something scrape across the back of the cabin. Not a small animal, something larger. I held my breath. It stopped. Then I heard it again, lower down, like someone dragging a stick against the wall. I crept to the back window and tried to see, but it was too dark. I waited for what felt like hours before falling asleep against the wall. In the morning, I found a long scratch running across the cabin's back wall, about 4 feet off the ground, like someone had taken a branch or metal rod and run it across the wood. Below it, a small pile of stones had been stacked neatly.
No prints.
No sign of life, just a scratch and stones. By the 6th day, I didn't feel like myself. I hadn't eaten much. I was exhausted. I kept checking the same spots over and over, behind the outhouse, under the porch, in the trees. I kept the knife with me always, even when I went to relieve myself. I hadn't seen anyone, not even a shape or shadow, just signs. I didn't know what they wanted. That night, I snapped. I heard a loud bang against the door just after midnight. I ran to it, threw it open with the knife in hand. There was no one, but there was something new. A circle of stones in the dirt about 10 feet from the door, with a dead rabbit placed neatly in the center. His throat had been slit clean. Not torn, not chewed, cut. That was it. I was done. I didn't sleep that night. I packed everything before dawn and left the cabin as the sun came up. I didn't bother putting the chair back or cleaning the dishes. I just drove. The 15-mile dirt road felt twice as long. I kept checking the rearview mirror. When I got home, I went straight to the building manager and had the locks changed, even though no one knew where I had gone. For days, I couldn't sleep properly. Every noise made me jump. I kept looking out the windows, but eventually, the fear dulled. A few weeks later, I was going through the photos on my phone, thinking I might delete some to clear space. I found the one of the porch chair, the one I had taken to prove its position. I zoomed in. At first, I couldn't tell what felt wrong. Then I saw it through the gap in the trees, just behind the chair, barely visible in the shadow. A face, pale, narrow eyes, long stringy hair, staring at the cabin. I deleted the photo. I don't tell people about the trip, not because I'm afraid they won't believe me, but because I don't want to give whatever that was any more space in my life. I never went back. I never will. It was the middle of October when I drove up to a small wooden cabin deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. The place belonged to a friend of a friend who barely used it anymore, and I had asked if I could borrow it for a week to clear my head. Life had been too loud lately. I needed something quiet, isolated, still, the kind of stillness that only comes from being miles away from another human being. The cabin was supposed to be off-grid. No cell reception, no internet, no power except a small generator, and no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took longer than expected. The road changed from 2-lane pavement to rough gravel after the last small town. I had filled up the gas tank and picked up groceries on the way, enough canned food, dry goods, water, and coffee to last me over a week. I even brought an extra 5-gallon gas can for the generator, though I didn't plan on using it much. I wanted to rough it, get back to basics, just me, nature, and the cold mountain air. By the time I arrived, the sun had already dipped below the peaks. The shadows stretched long across the clearing where the cabin sat. The structure was old but solid. Wooden logs darkened by time and weather. The roof slanted steeply, built for snow. A small porch with 2 steps led to the front door. No fence, no path, no mailbox. Just trees and silence in every direction. I parked my car off to the side and unloaded everything. There wasn't much. A sleeping bag, a small backpack of clothes, groceries, flashlight, lantern, some tools, a folding chair. The inside of the cabin was one large room. One window, one door, a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchenette with an old propane stove. No free, just a wooden counter, a few shelves with dusty mugs and plates, a single bed frame without a mattress. That didn't bother me. I had my sleeping bag. The air smelled like dry pine and cold earth. I left the door open as I swept out a few leaves and bits of dirt, then rolled out my sleeping bag on top of the wood planks. The wood stove looked functional, so I set it up and got a fire going with some of the split logs stacked outside. The warmth spread slowly. I boiled some water on the stove, made instant coffee, and sat in silence while sipping it. The first night passed quietly. I woke up once when a gust of wind shook the cabin, but otherwise it was peaceful. The wind howled at times, but nothing unusual. In the morning, I stepped outside to a world of golden light and frost. Everything shimmered. I wandered a bit, stretching my legs, then decided to hike out behind the cabin, where the land sloped gently downward into a shallow ravine. I took my time, walking through the brush and trees, just breathing in the air. Nothing felt wrong. The second night, I stayed up later, staring into the fire. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the trees. I kept the lantern nearby and even turned on the generator for a bit to charge my phone, though I knew there was no signal. Just habit, I guess. I read part of a paperback I'd brought, then turned in. Again, peaceful, cold, but I had layered up. It was on the third day that I started to notice small things. First, I found boot prints behind the cabin. Not mine. These were deeper, wider, maybe from someone heavier. They came from the trees, stopped about 20 feet from the back of the cabin, then disappeared. I assumed they were old. Maybe the owner had come by before I arrived, but they hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of that. That night, I slept lightly. I kept waking up to small noises. I thought I heard crunching outside, like leaves or twigs. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move across the single window, but I told myself it was the firelight flickering. Just nerves. I forced myself to sleep. In the morning, I found the latch on the shed out back had been unhooked. It was just a small tool shed with some rusted garden tools and a few cans of paint. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. The door swung open when I checked. Nothing seemed missing, but I didn't like it. I started walking the perimeter of the clearing every hour or two, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to convince myself everything was normal. I didn't see more tracks, and I didn't hear anything, but I felt watched. It was a weird feeling that clung to me even in the sunlight. The trees felt closer. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire burning, even though I was running low on logs. I pulled my sleeping bag right next to the wood stove and sat up for hours just listening. There were creaks and groans from the trees, branches shifting, the wind, but there was also something else. At one point, I was sure I heard slow footsteps outside the cabin. I held my breath. The steps crunched around the side, paused near the back, then faded. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, just stared at the door. I didn't go outside that morning. Not right away. I waited until the sun was high and the shadows were short. When I did finally step out, I found fresh tracks again. This time clearer. Large boots, deep prints. Someone had walked around the cabin during the night, all the way around. The tracks circled the structure twice, then headed back into the trees. I told myself it was a hunter or a hiker who got lost, maybe a ranger doing rounds. But who walks around someone's cabin at night without knocking? Why come back 2 nights in a row? I took out the hatchet I had brought and kept it close after that. I didn't want to leave early, but the thought was growing in my head. I boiled more water, made coffee, ate quietly, and kept my eyes on the tree line. I didn't see movement, but the feeling of being watched had sunk deep into my chest now. I set a few small traps with cans and string near the back of the cabin. Nothing fancy, just enough to make noise if someone came close. That night, I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, staring at the window. The fire was down to coals. I didn't want the light to give away my position. Around midnight, I heard a metallic clink, one of the cans, then another. My heart thudded so loud I thought it would give me away. I grabbed the hatchet, tiptoed to the window and peeked out. Nothing, but I knew someone was out there. There were no more sounds. I stayed up until morning, eyes dry, muscles sore. When the sun came up, I went outside. The traps had been triggered. One can was 10 feet away, crushed. The string was snapped. More prints circled the cabin. I counted 4 loops around the place. Then they vanished into the woods again. That was it. I decided I was done. I packed what I could, threw it into the car, and started driving. I didn't bother sweeping up or dousing the coals. I just wanted to get out of there. The dirt road felt longer, The woods felt thicker. I kept looking in the rearview mirror like someone might step out onto the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station back in town. I went inside, bought coffee, used the bathroom, and sat in my car for a long time. The clerk gave me a few looks, probably because I looked tired and wired. I didn't care. I never found out who it was. Maybe just someone messing around. Maybe someone looking for a place to squat. But the way they circled, the way they never made contact, the silent walking, it didn't feel like random kids. It felt like someone who knew how to move without being seen. Someone who wanted me to leave but didn't want to show their face. I told my friend I wouldn't be going back. Told them the place needed better locks. Maybe a trail cam, but I didn't give them details. I didn't want to sound crazy. I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the cabin. But whatever it was, I got out before I could find out. And that was enough for me. It was mid-October when I decided to take a break from the city. I had been dealing with too much stress. Late nights at the office, barely any sleep, and a kind of mental fog that wouldn't go away. I needed some real quiet, far from traffic, lights, or emails. I booked a remote cabin deep in the northern woods, a place I found online that was advertised as completely off the grid. No electricity, no running water, and no cell signal. Just a roof, a fireplace, and miles of wilderness. I drove 6 hours north, further than I had ever gone before. The last hour of the drive was down a gravel road that felt barely used. Trees closed in on both sides, and I didn't pass another car. It felt like I was entering a different world. I kept checking my GPS until the signal dropped completely, then followed the printed instructions the owner had emailed me. I finally reached the turnoff, marked only by a faded blue ribbon tied to a tree branch. The path to the cabin was rough and overgrown, but I managed to get my car through it without damage. When I pulled up to the cabin, I shut off the engine and just sat there for a minute, taking in the silence. It was so quiet it felt like pressure on my ears. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, and it looked like it had been standing there for 100 years. It had a front porch with a crooked railing and a single rocking chair that looked like it would fall apart if I touched it. The front door creaked loudly when I opened it. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a hand pump for water, and a bedroom in the back.
No mirrors, no clock.
Just bare essentials. I unpacked my gear slowly, trying to get used to the feeling of being this far removed from everything. The first day passed uneventfully. I chopped some firewood, tested the pump, and made myself a simple dinner with the supplies I had brought. I had a small solar-powered lantern and a book to keep me company. I slept early, wrapped in a sleeping bag on the old bed. The mattress creaked every time I moved, but I was tired enough that I didn't care. The next morning, I woke up at dawn. I made some instant coffee and sat on the porch. The fog was thick over the trees, and everything felt damp and still. Around midday, I went for a walk, following a deer trail that looped behind the cabin. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or two, and came back before it got dark. Still, the whole time I was walking, I had a strange feeling in my stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense that something was off, like I was being watched, but there was no one around. I kept looking back, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked outside. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps near the porch. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, but didn't hear it again. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some animal sniffing around. I eventually dozed off. The next day, things started getting strange. When I stepped outside in the morning, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet. The prints were small, maybe the size of a child's foot, but the shape was odd. The toes were too long, almost claw-like. I stared at them for a while, then walked around the cabin to see where they led. They circled the cabin twice, then disappeared into the woods. I tried to stay calm. Maybe someone had camped nearby. Maybe it was just a trick of the dirt. But I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I spent the rest of the day double-checking the cabin. making sure the door locked, making sure my tools were where I left them. I didn't go for a walk that day. I stayed close and built up the firewood pile, even though I already had enough. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I kept the lantern on and sat by the fireplace, pretending to read. The wind had stopped, and the forest was silent again. I kept glancing at the windows. Around 1 a.m., I heard something tapping. It wasn't loud, just light taps, coming from the back of the cabin. Then it moved.
Top, top, top.
Around the side, then the front. I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, ears straining. The tapping stopped after a few minutes. I waited another hour before forcing myself to go to bed. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The footprints were back. Same size, same shape. This time they stopped right under my bedroom window. I felt my stomach twist. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was hours away, and I hadn't seen another soul in days. I decided to stay one more night, just one, and leave at first light. I packed up most of my gear and kept it by the door. That day I barely ate. I didn't go outside. I just waited. When the sun started going down, I lit the fire early and sat with my hatchet in hand. I turned off the lantern to keep the inside dark so I could see out the windows better. Around midnight, I heard it again. Light tapping, then the sound of something brushing against the wall. Then silence. Then I heard the back door creak. Not the front one I had been watching, but the smaller one that led out to the woodshed. It had a latch, but no lock. I stood up slowly, hatchet raised, and moved toward the back of the cabin. I didn't turn on the light. I just stood by the doorway, listening. I could hear breathing, faint and shaky, like someone standing just outside. I didn't open the door. I stayed there until the breathing stopped. The next morning, I opened the door. Nothing was there, but on the ground, in the dirt, were more prints. This time, 2 sets. One was the same as before, small and clawed. The other was larger, like a grown man's bare foot, but deformed. The heel was high, and the toes dug deep into the soil like it had been walking on its toes. I didn't even finish breakfast. I grabbed my gear, threw it in the car, and left without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. That feeling, the pressure, the wrongness, it didn't leave until I was well on my way back to the city. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just wild animals, maybe bears or something else. But one night, I was going through my backpack, reorganizing my camping gear, and I found something I didn't pack. It was a small bundle of twigs, tied together with a strip of what looked like animal hide. The twigs were bent in the same shape as that footprint, the long, claw-like toes. I burned it in the fireplace that night and threw the ashes in the trash. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still love the idea of being alone, far from the noise, but that trip changed something in me. Some places aren't meant for people. Some silence hides things that don't want to be found. I don't know what I saw. I don't care anymore. All I know is I made it out and I'm not going back. Not ever. It was early October when I drove out to the cabin. The air was starting to cool down, and the trees lining the mountain roads had just begun to change color. Red, yellow, orange. Everything looked like it was on fire. I had been working nonstop for months, drowning in deadlines and stress. So I rented a small off-grid cabin for a week to unwind. It was supposed to be quiet, simple, and peaceful. No phone service, no internet. Just trees, a wood stove, and some time alone. That was the plan. The cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town and sat near the edge of a lake surrounded by dense forest. The road leading up to it was a narrow dirt path filled with potholes and sharp turns. I had to drive slowly just to avoid getting stuck. When I finally pulled up, the place looked even more isolated than it did in the photos online. It was a one-room log cabin with a small porch out front and a rusty metal roof. There was an outhouse about 30 feet away in the trees and a shed that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small cot against the wall, and a single table with 2 chairs. The windows were dusty and fogged up from the inside. A few spider webs clung to the ceiling beams, and the floor creaked when I walked. There was a kind of stillness inside, the kind you don't get in the city. It was quiet enough to hear my own breathing, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally relax. The first day went by uneventfully. I unpacked my gear, stacked some firewood, and went for a walk down to the lake. The sun was starting to set when I got back. I made a small fire in the wood stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat on the porch with a flashlight and a book. The sky turned deep purple as the stars came out, and I remember thinking how perfect it was. That night, I barely slept. I wasn't scared or uncomfortable, just restless. The forest was noisy in a way I wasn't used to. Every small sound seemed amplified. Crickets chirping, owls calling, branches creaking. Around 2 a.m., I heard something heavier, something crunching through the leaves. I froze. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't small either. I waited, heart pounding, until it faded. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I kept the hatchet close to my cot for the rest of the night. The next day, I was tired but tried not to let it get to me. I spent the morning chopping firewood and cleaning up the cabin. Around noon, I hiked a mile up the ridge behind the cabin to get a better view of the lake. I sat up there for a while, just watching the water, listening to the wind. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, like the forest is listening back. On the way down, I noticed something odd. A small path I hadn't seen before. It looked like it had been used recently. Fresh prints in the dirt. Not boots, not animals, just prints. Bare feet, deep ones. I stood there for a few minutes staring at the trail. My skin went cold. Who the hell walks around out here barefoot? The prints led off into the woods, away from the lake. I followed them for a few yards, then stopped. The trees felt tighter here, like they were pressing in on both sides. The air smelled different, like wet moss and rot. I turned around and walked quickly back to the cabin. I didn't want to think too much about it. Probably just a hunter or something. Still, I locked the cabin door that night. Again, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Snapping branches, slow footsteps. At one point, something brushed against the side of the cabin. I held my breath and waited. Nothing else happened, but it took hours for me to fall asleep again. In the morning, I found something strange. A pile of small stones stacked neatly on the porch. 5 of them smooth and round. I didn't put them there. I didn't touch them. I swept them off the edge and tried to ignore it. That afternoon, I checked the trail again. The footprints were gone, washed out by rain during the night. I hiked farther up the ridge this time, trying to shake off the creeping feeling in my gut. The trees were quiet. No birds, no bugs, just wind. I don't know how far I went, maybe 2 miles before I found it. Another cabin, not on any map I'd seen. It was smaller than mine, falling apart, half rotten. The door was open, hanging off the hinges. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and mold. There were old blankets on the floor, a broken lantern, and bones. Not fresh, not human, but bones, piled in the corner. I backed out slowly and made my way back without stopping. Couldn't sleep at all that night. I kept hearing noises, whispers, low, steady rustling like someone was moving just outside the window. I stayed inside, clutching the hatchet, waiting for morning. When the sun came up, I found more stones. This time they were on the windowsill, 8 of them smaller than before. I was done pretending it was nothing. I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and decided to head out early. Screw the remaining days. I just wanted to leave. When I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Just clicked. I checked the hood, the battery cables were cut. Clean. Someone had done it while I slept. My stomach dropped. I ran back to the cabin, bolted the door, and stayed there all day, pacing. I had no signal, no way to contact help. My emergency radio was still in the truck, and I didn't dare leave again. I sat by the window all night, not blinking, barely breathing. In the morning, I tried to fix the battery with duct tape and wire. It was a mess, but the engine turned over on the 4th try. I floored it down the trail, not stopping for anything. The road was worse now, washed out in places from rain. Branches scraped the side of the truck. At one point, I nearly slid into a ditch, but I kept going. I didn't look back. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station and just sat there, shaking. I told the clerk my battery had been tampered with, but I left out the rest. What could I say? That someone had been watching me? That they left stones and cut my cables in the night? He just looked at me like I was overreacting. Back home, I tried to forget about it. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I didn't want to hear how it was probably just a prank or my imagination. But it wasn't. It was real. I can still see those footprints in the dirt, still hear the rustling outside the windows. I don't go hiking alone anymore. I don't camp off-grid, and I sure as hell won't ever step foot near that lake again. I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just some recluse living off the grid, keeping watch over his land. Maybe it was someone who liked messing with people who got too close. But whoever it was, they knew I was there. They watched me. They waited. And if my truck hadn't started that morning, I don't think I would have made it out. That place wasn't empty. It just looked that way. I booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana for a week-long break. I had been feeling burned out from work, and I wanted silence. Real silence. Not just no phone calls or emails, but no traffic, no neighbors, no responsibilities. Just me, a small wooden cabin, and a stretch of forest that went on for miles. I found the listing through a small local site. It wasn't part of a rental chain or anything fancy. Just an old man named Frank who owned a handful of off-grid places. He sent me a map, printed instructions, and the key by mail. I left early in the morning to make the long drive north. As the city slipped behind, the roads got smaller, narrower, and rougher. It took me the whole day to get there. The last stretch was on a dirt road that hadn't been graded in a long time. Trees lined both sides so thick that daylight barely reached the road. My tires crunched slowly over rocks and twigs until finally, the cabin came into view. It was small and basic. A single story, weathered wood, a stone chimney, no neighbors in sight. The nearest town was at least 45 minutes back the way I came. Inside was clean but old. A wood stove, a cot with a thick sleeping bag, a small table, and 2 chairs. There was a manual water pump out back and a small outhouse further down the hill. No electricity, no phone service. Just me and the trees. I dropped my bags and walked around outside for a while. The silence was strange at first. My ears strained for sound. No distant cars. No humming refrigerators. Just wind and the occasional creak of a branch. I made a small fire in the stove and warmed up some canned chili. Then I sat in the chair and stared at the wall. It was peaceful, but in a way that made you face your thoughts without anything to distract you. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't fear exactly, just a feeling that something was off. Maybe it was how dark it got after sunset. Real, total black. I'd never seen darkness like that before. Even when I shut my eyes, it didn't feel as dark as when they were open. Every creak of the wood sounded louder. Every rustle outside made my heart beat faster. I kept telling myself it was just animals, just wind, just the natural sounds of being away from the world. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I made coffee on the stove and ate a protein bar for breakfast. Then I hiked a few miles in one direction, marked a few trees with ribbon, and made sure I could find my way back. The forest was beautiful, thick with pine, cold and damp, and alive with tiny movements. But I still felt watched. Maybe I wasn't used to being alone. Maybe that part of my brain that was always alert in cities had nothing to focus on, so it latched onto every movement. By day 3, I was starting to feel better. I slept a little more. I read the old survival manual that came with the cabin. I even whittled a little just to pass time. But I noticed things. Little things, scratches near the doorframe that weren't there when I arrived. Rocks moved in a pattern near the fire pit. Nothing huge, nothing I could point to and say something was wrong, but I kept feeling it. That sense that someone somewhere was near. On the 4th night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what woke me. The fire in the stove had burned down, and it was cold. I pulled on a jacket and added wood to the fire. As I was kneeling in front of the stove, I heard it. a soft crunch outside, like a footstep. I froze. I told myself it was probably a deer, but then I heard it again, closer, then a pause, then another step. I turned out the lantern and stayed quiet, my ears strained in the dark. More movement, around the back of the cabin now. I held my breath. I had no weapons, no cell service, just a fire poker and a utility knife. I held the poker tight. I told myself not to panic, but the footsteps stopped. I waited in silence for maybe 10 minutes. Then, slowly, I opened the door a crack and looked outside. The moonlight was barely enough to see, but I didn't see anyone. I stepped out, walked slowly around the cabin, listening. Nothing, just wind. I circled the whole place twice and didn't find anything. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and sat awake until sunrise. The next day, I found tracks, footprints, not boots, bare feet, human, around the side of the cabin, pressed into the mud. I followed them about 30 feet into the woods, and then they vanished, just disappeared, like someone had walked backwards to cover them, or climbed into a tree. I couldn't explain it. I felt a lump in my throat and a tightness in my chest. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want to overreact. I stayed that day. I tried to make noise, tried to act big. I sang out loud when I hiked. I chopped firewood. I tried to convince myself it was a prank or just a drifter passing through, but I couldn't shake the fear. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with the poker in hand and a flashlight on my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard tapping. Not footsteps this time. Tapping on the window. Slow. One tap every few seconds. I didn't move. I aimed the flashlight at the window but didn't turn it on. I waited. The tapping stopped. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps again. I stayed frozen until daylight. The next morning, I packed up. I was supposed to stay 3 more nights, but I couldn't do it. I threw my stuff in the duffel, made sure the fire was out, and locked the cabin behind me. I made one last circle around the cabin. That's when I saw something new. Hanging from a branch near the outhouse was a piece of cloth. A torn shirt, not mine. Old and faded, but recent enough to still have color. Below it, half buried in the leaves, was a rusted tin can with food wrappers stuffed inside. Someone had been out here. I didn't wait. I drove down the dirt road fast, tires sliding on gravel, branches scraping the side of my car. When I hit the pavement again, I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. I told the clerk someone had been creeping around my cabin. He just nodded and said a lot of folks squatted in the woods, especially near old logging routes. I made it home safely. I didn't call Frank or leave a review. I didn't want anything to do with that place again. For weeks afterward, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every bump in the night at my apartment made me jump. I kept my curtains closed, double-locked the doors, and left the TV on just to have some sound around me. Took a long time before I went back into the woods. Even now, years later, I still think about that cabin. I wonder who was out there, what they wanted, if they were just curious, or if they were waiting for something. I don't know. I never will. But I've learned this. Just because you're alone doesn't mean you're not being watched. I needed a break from the city. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush. It was getting too much. So I rented a cabin up north, about 3 hours from where I lived. It sat near a small lake, surrounded by thick pine woods, with no neighbors in sight. That was the whole point. I wanted quiet, fresh air, and to be alone for a while. I found the listing on a small vacation site. It looked clean in the photos, simple and cozy. A log cabin with 1 bedroom, a wood stove, and a big front porch. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely a signal on my phone. Just the woods, the lake, and me. I drove up on a Friday morning in early October. The weather had just started to cool, and the leaves were beginning to turn yellow and orange. The air smelled different up there, earthy and cold, not like the city. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, I liked what I saw. The cabin was a little older than the photos made it seem, but still in good shape. The roof looked solid and the porch steps were sturdy. There was a small woodpile stacked neatly on the side, just like the owner said there would be. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and something else, maybe pine cleaner. The living room was small, with a single couch facing a wood stove. A small kitchen with an old fridge and gas stove sat on the left. There was a hallway leading to the bedroom and a bathroom, both basic but clean. The windows had thick curtains, and there was a metal lock on the front door. The back door led to a small deck that looked out over the trees. There was one thing I hadn't noticed in the listing, though. In the far corner of the kitchen, behind the little dining table, was a wooden door set into the floor. A cellar door. I didn't like that much. I've never liked basements or cellars. Something about being underground, shut in, has always made me uneasy. But the door had a big rusty padlock on it, so I figured it wasn't in use. I pushed the table back a little, just enough to open the fridge door fully, and ignored it. The first day was peaceful. I unloaded my gear, set up my sleeping bag on the bed just to make things easier, and brought in some firewood. I didn't need a fire yet, but I wanted to be ready. I cooked some canned soup for dinner, then sat out on the porch with a book until the sun went down. It got dark fast. I had a flashlight and some battery lanterns, so I was fine. But it was quiet, too quiet. No cars, no planes, not even wind. Just the occasional rustle of branches and the sound of water lapping at the lake's edge. That night, I lay in bed listening to the silence. I thought it would be calming, but it made me tense. Every creak of the cabin or snap of a twig outside made my heart jump a little. I told myself it was just part of adjusting. I had lived with noise for so long that quiet felt unnatural. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I made instant coffee and went for a short hike behind the cabin. There was a narrow trail that led up a ridge and gave a good view of the lake. I saw deer tracks in the mud, maybe a raccoon or fox too. Felt good to move, to breathe air that didn't smell like car exhaust. That afternoon, I brought in more firewood and lit the stove for the first time. The warmth helped. I sat in front of it with my book and felt myself start to relax. That night, I heard something. It was just after midnight. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a sharp creak from the kitchen. The kind of creak a heavy door might make when it shifts. I froze, staring at the dark ceiling. The cabin made noises. I knew that. Wood settles. Wind pushes on the walls. But this was different. I got up and turned on my flashlight. I walked quietly into the kitchen. Everything looked the same. The table, the fridge, the chairs. Nothing was out of place. But I noticed something then. The wooden cellar door. There was dust around the edges, and I swear it looked disturbed, like it had been moved. I checked the padlock. Still there. Still closed. I even tugged it. Solid. But I still didn't feel right. I went back to bed and lay there until morning, eyes open. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. I told myself it was just old wood shifting in the cold. But I kept glancing at it while I cooked breakfast, while I read on the couch. At one point, I dragged the table over it completely, just to block it from view. That helped a little. Later that afternoon, I went down to the lake to clear my head. I sat on a rock and skipped stones until it got too cold to stay. When I came back up to the cabin, I stopped in my tracks. The table had been moved. Not a lot, just pushed back a few inches. But I had put it right over the cellar door. Now the edge of the door was visible again. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I checked the door. The lock was still in place. But I couldn't explain the table. I lived alone. No one was out here. That night, I barricaded the kitchen. I pushed the fridge halfway in front of the door and stacked 2 chairs against it. I even piled some firewood on top, just to be safe. I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. Not a creak this time. It was a low, dragging sound, slow and steady, like something heavy being pulled across wood. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then silence. I stayed in bed, paralyzed. In the morning, the chairs were tipped over. The fridge had shifted back. The firewood was on the floor. The lock was still there, but I knew something wasn't right. I thought about leaving, but I had no proof of anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I bumped the chairs without realizing. Maybe the fridge rolled a bit on its own. I made excuses. but I didn't stay another night. I packed my stuff and left around noon, even though I had 2 days left. On my way out, I took one last look at the cellar. I even took a photo. The lock was still in place, but the door looked different now. The edges were clean, like someone had wiped them. I didn't go back. I left a review saying the place was fine, just a little too quiet for my taste. But a week later, I got a message from the cabin owner. She asked me if I had used the cellar. I said no, of course not. It was locked the whole time. She wrote back a single line. The lock was broken when I arrived, and the door was open. That stayed with me. I didn't reply. I didn't want to know what she found down there. It was early October when I decided to get away from everything for a while. Life had been loud and fast for too long. I was tired of the city, the noise, the traffic, and the constant stream of people. I needed to reset my head. So I rented a small cabin up in the mountains of Montana, deep in the woods, far from the main road. It was cheap, isolated, and had everything I needed: a bed, a small kitchen, running water, and a wood-burning stove. The drive there was long and rough. Once I left the highway, I had to take a gravel road that twisted up into the hills. The road was full of potholes, and my old truck didn't like it one bit. The sun was already dipping low by the time I reached the cabin. I parked beside it, got out and stretched. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. There were no other houses in sight, just trees and shadows. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It looked older too, like it had been built 30 or 40 years ago and hadn't seen many repairs since. But it was clean inside, simple. There was one main room with a table, a couple of chairs, a couch, and the wood stove. A small hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The windows were small and had thick curtains. No TV, no internet, no phone signal. That first night, I felt peace I hadn't felt in years. I sat on the porch with a cup of hot coffee and listened to the wind moving through the trees. It was quiet, really quiet. I hadn't realized how much background noise I'd gotten used to. My thoughts were clearer without the constant buzz of the city. I went to bed early and slept straight through. The next few days were calm. I spent my time hiking the trails nearby, chopping wood, and reading. I cooked simple meals, kept the fire going, and wrote in a notebook I'd brought. I was finally breathing easy again. I didn't see a single person, not even a hunter or another hiker. I liked that. On the 4th day, I decided to hike farther than usual. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that went deeper into the forest. I followed it for hours, winding through thick pines and rocky slopes. Around noon, I stopped near a creek to eat a sandwich and drink some water. The forest felt alive, but not in a friendly way. I started to feel like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the silence playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something strange. About 30 feet off the trail, partly hidden behind some trees, there was an old campsite. A rusted metal fire ring, a half-buried canteen, and what looked like a torn tarp. I stepped closer, curious. The campsite looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Moss had grown over the edges of the tarp. The canteen was cracked. A pair of boots sat nearby, weather-worn and falling apart. It was odd, but not scary, just forgotten. What bothered me was the smell. It hit me when I got closer. It was faint but sharp, like something rotting. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. I circled around, but didn't see anything. Just the same old trees, rocks, and damp leaves. I decided to head back. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, something changed. Couldn't sleep. I kept hearing small noises outside the cabin. Not the wind, not animals. It sounded like footsteps, slow, careful steps moving around the porch. I sat up in bed and waited, but nothing happened. I finally got up, grabbed the flashlight, and looked out through the window. Nothing, just dark trees and the empty porch. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. They weren't mine. I knew that right away. They were fresh and led from the woods straight up to the porch. Then they stopped, like someone had come right up to the door, stood there for a while, and then turned around and walked back. They weren't boot prints. They looked like someone had been walking barefoot. The ground was cold. The air had been close to freezing that night. Who the hell would be out there with no shoes? I tried to stay calm. I told myself maybe it was just some drifter or a lost hiker. Maybe someone came by looking for help. But that didn't explain why they didn't knock, or why they came and left in the middle of the night. I didn't see the prints go anywhere else, just from the trees to the porch and back again. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept my axe nearby. I checked the lock on the door 3 times. I didn't see anyone. No movement in the trees. Nothing. But that feeling was back. The feeling of being watched. The next night was worse. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was cold. Then I heard it again. The slow, steady sound of feet on the porch. Just one set, I think. Not hurried, just pacing. I sat still, heart pounding, listening. The steps moved to the side of the cabin, then to the back. I didn't hear them leave. I stayed in bed, afraid to move. Eventually, I dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, the sun was already up, and the footsteps were gone. I went outside and checked again. More prints, still barefoot. This time they were all around the cabin, circling it, like someone had been walking laps. I checked the woods with my binoculars. Still no one. By that point, I was seriously freaked out. I packed some of my stuff and decided to leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive down that rocky road at night. I figured if I could make it through one more night, I'd be fine. That evening, I stayed inside with all the lights on. I didn't cook, just ate a granola bar and drank water. I didn't even light the fire. I didn't want to give away that I was there. I sat on the couch with the axe beside me, waiting, listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was tapping, light tapping on the glass, like a fingernail on the window pane. I froze. The curtains were closed. I didn't move. The tapping came again. Then silence. I waited. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Just once. Just a light twist. I gripped the axe tighter. My mouth was dry. The sound stopped. Then footsteps again, moving slowly around the cabin. After a while, it all went quiet. I didn't sleep at all. I sat up until dawn. As soon as the sun came up, I threw my stuff into the truck and left. I didn't even clean up. I just got the hell out of there. On the way back down the mountain, I stopped at a gas station and told the clerk what happened. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, people go up there and hear things. That cabin's been sitting empty for a long time." I never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there. I didn't see a face. I didn't hear a voice. Just the sound of bare feet in the cold, walking slow around a forgotten cabin in the woods. I tried to look up information later. I checked forums and news sites. Nothing. No missing hikers. No reports of strange people in the area. Just silence. I learned something important up there. The woods are deep. They're quiet. But they're not always empty. And I don't think I was ever really alone. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything. Life in the city had been getting to me. Long days at work, endless noise, and the constant stress of people everywhere. I couldn't take it anymore. I had some unused vacation days, and I needed space to breathe, to think, to just be alone. I searched online and found a remote cabin listed on an old website, hidden deep in the northern woods. It wasn't fancy, just a single-room cabin with a fireplace, a basic kitchen, and no cell signal. It sounded perfect. The drive took nearly 7 hours. The last 2 hours were on a dirt road full of potholes and deep ruts. My small SUV handled it all right, but I had to go slow. Trees closed in tightly on both sides, and the sun barely made it through the thick canopy. The map I'd printed out said I'd find the cabin at the end of the road, about a half-mile walk in. Sure enough, the road ended in a little turnaround with enough space for maybe 2 cars. I parked and grabbed my backpack, locking the rest of my gear inside the vehicle. The walk to the cabin was quiet. There were no birds, no bugs, no sound at all except the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The path was narrow and slightly overgrown, like it hadn't been used much in years. Still, the cabin appeared just where the map said it would be, sitting in a small clearing made of dark, weathered wood with a sagging porch and an old chimney poking out the top. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A single bed against one wall, a small wood-burning stove, shelves with a few pots and pans, and a narrow table with 2 chairs. There was an outhouse about 20 yards out back and a hand pump well a little closer to the side. The place felt old but solid. It was exactly what I needed. The first day went by easily. I unpacked, gathered some wood, and settled in. I read a book most of the evening and went to bed early. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The kind of deep, dreamless sleep that resets something in you. The kind you only get far away from the noise. The second day, I hiked out along the old logging trails that ran through the woods. The area was so untouched it felt like stepping into the past. No signs of people, no litter, no paths, no cabins, nothing. Just deep woods and silence. I brought my compass and a whistle, made sure I could backtrack, and kept my bearings. I returned in the late afternoon, cooked up some beans and rice, and sat on the porch as the sky turned orange and purple. It was peaceful. I felt better than I had in years. That night, something changed. I was sleeping deeply when I was pulled awake by a sound. Not loud, but strange. Like a single, sharp crack of wood splitting, then silence. I sat up in the dark. The fire in the stove had died to embers, and the inside of the cabin was cold. I listened hard but didn't hear anything else. Maybe it was just an old tree shifting or a branch falling. I lay back down. Just as I was drifting off again, I heard it. A softer noise this time. A shuffle, like something brushing against the wall outside. I held my breath. It was faint but close, right outside. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept thinking it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer. Nothing to worry about. Still, my ears stayed sharp all night, and I woke up exhausted. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was covered in leaves, but near the back corner, I noticed some were pushed aside in an odd pattern. Not boot prints exactly, but not like any animal I could name either. Just wide, flat disturbances. I figured maybe a bear had wandered through. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I read, split some wood, cooked, and tried not to think about the night before. But as dusk came on, the quietness started to feel heavy again. That kind of silence that presses on your chest. I locked the door, latched the windows, and kept the fire going a little longer than usual. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time to a tapping sound. Slow, deliberate, like someone gently knocking on wood. I froze. Came from the porch. I sat up slowly and looked at the window. Nothing. I waited. The tapping continued, off and on. Then it stopped. Then, sharp footsteps across the porch boards. I didn't move. My breath was shallow, heart racing. The steps paused just outside the door. Then silence. I sat like that for what felt like an hour. Nothing more came. I stayed awake till morning. The next day, I wanted to leave, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I felt like I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen anything, just sounds, and it could have been an animal, but something felt wrong. I checked the porch in the morning. One of the rocking chairs had been moved, shifted over to the far side of the door. I was sure I hadn't done that. The seat was damp from the night air, except where something had clearly been sitting. There was a dry spot the shape of a person. I packed a day bag and hiked back to my SUV. I considered just leaving, but the idea of driving those 2 hours of rough trail after barely sleeping made me hesitate. I stood by the car for a while thinking. In the end, I decided to stay one more night, leave early in the morning when I had daylight. That evening, I built a bigger fire. I brought the hatchet inside. I kept the stove hot, the room lit. I sat on the bed and read, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking at the windows, listening, waiting. At around 2 a.m., I heard movement again. Not on the porch this time, but at the back of the cabin. Slow steps through leaves, something circling. I grabbed the hatchet and sat still. Then a soft thump. Something tapped against the rear wall. Then again. Then silence. Suddenly, the front door rattled. Not like before. Not gentle. Shook hard once, then again. I jumped to my feet. The windows stayed dark. No shadow. No face. Just rattling, then nothing. I stood there till dawn. The moment the sky began to lighten, I grabbed my things. I didn't eat, didn't clean up. I just packed and left. The woods felt different as I walked back to the SUV. The silence was louder somehow, heavier. When I reached the car, I unlocked it fast, tossed my gear inside, and started the engine. As I turned the car around, I looked back toward the trail. Something stood at the tree line. Far enough away I couldn't see details, but close enough to know it wasn't an animal. Just standing, watching. I didn't stop. I drove. Those 2 hours back down the dirt road felt longer than the entire week. Every bump and shake made me grip the wheel tighter. Every bend, I expected to see something in the rearview mirror, but nothing followed me. I hit pavement just after noon. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I checked into a cheap motel, called my wife, and told her I'd cut the trip short. I didn't tell her why. Weeks passed. I tried to forget it, to make myself believe it was nothing. Maybe a squatter, maybe a hunter playing some sick joke, maybe my own mind playing tricks on me after being alone too long. But the memory never softened, and one thing kept haunting me. Before I left the cabin that morning, I'd gone to fill my water bottle at the pump. The handle was already wet, like someone had used it right before me, but I hadn't heard a sound. That was the last time I ever stayed alone in the woods. It started with a break. I had been working 12-hour days for weeks, barely sleeping, eating whatever I could microwave, and drowning in stress. My eyes were tired, my hands sore, and my head always pounding. I needed to step away from the noise and the endless buzz of the city. A friend of mine had mentioned an old cabin up in the hills, deep in the woods, where there was no phone signal, no internet, nothing but trees and quiet. That was exactly what I needed. I got the directions from him, packed up enough food and supplies for a week, and left at sunrise on a cold Monday morning. The drive was long. Asphalt turned into gravel, then gravel into dirt. The road was rough and narrow. Trees crowded both sides, their bare winter branches looking like bony arms reaching across the path. My GPS lost signal halfway up the mountain, so I followed the written directions carefully. I drove for almost 6 hours before I finally saw it. The old cabin, tucked between tall pine trees, its wooden frame dark with age. A small stream ran nearby, and there were no other houses or signs of people around. Just silence and nature. The cabin itself looked old but solid. It had one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a separate room in the back that served as a bedroom. There was no electricity, just a couple of oil lanterns hanging from nails on the walls. The water came from a nearby pump, and the toilet was an outhouse about 20 feet behind the cabin. I didn't mind. That was what I had signed up for. I unpacked my bags, chopped some wood, got the stove going, and made myself a simple dinner. That night, I slept like a rock. The next few days were quiet. I woke with the sun, made coffee on the stove, and sat outside listening to the wind move through the trees. I took long walks in the woods, following animal tracks and exploring the area. I read old books by lantern light at night, ate canned soup, and just let my mind rest. I hadn't felt that calm in years, but by the 4th day, something started to feel off. I noticed it first when I woke up to find the firewood I had stacked neatly on the porch scattered across the yard. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into it, but it didn't look like an animal had done it. The pieces were flung far from the pile, and a few looked like they'd been thrown, not dragged. I cleaned it up and tried not to think too much about it. That evening, I was inside reading when I heard a noise. It sounded like someone walking in the leaves just outside the cabin. I froze and listened. The steps were slow and steady, circling the cabin. I stood up and grabbed the axe I'd left by the door. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just stood there in the dark, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes. I waited a while before opening the door and stepping out. Nothing. The moon was out, casting long shadows, but I didn't see anyone or anything. The woods were quiet again. I locked the door and didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks or signs of who or what might have been out there. I found footprints, human ones. They circled the cabin just like I'd heard. They led off into the woods, away from the road. My chest tightened. I thought maybe someone had gotten lost or was camping nearby, but the prints were fresh and close to the cabin. It didn't make sense. I told myself it could have been a hiker. I even shouted out into the trees, hoping someone might answer, but there was no reply. I felt uneasy all day. Every sound made me jump. I stopped going for walks and stayed near the cabin with the axe always in reach. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark with the axe, staring at the door, my ears straining for any sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, slower. They came right up to the porch and stopped. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever it was would hear it. Then I heard a soft tapping on the door. Just 3 quiet knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping came again, a little louder. Then nothing, just silence. I sat there all night, staring at the door. As soon as the sun came up, I opened it and looked around. No one, but the axe marks were there. On the door, 3 small dents where someone had tapped it with something metal. I was done. I packed my bag, threw everything into the back of the truck, and got ready to leave. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I checked the hood. Everything looked fine. No lights had been left on. I tried again. Nothing. I was stuck. I spent the whole day trying to figure out what to do. I had no signal, no way to call for help, and the nearest house was probably miles away. I didn't want to walk through those woods, not after what had been happening. I decided I'd try to hike back down the mountain in the morning. It would take hours, but I didn't want to spend another night up there. That night, I locked the door, blocked it with furniture, and stayed awake with the axe in my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was someone trying the door. The handle turned. Then the whole door shook as if someone was pushing hard against it. I held the axe tight, ready to fight. The pushing stopped, and I heard footsteps move away. But I didn't relax. I sat there until morning. As soon as it was light, I left. I didn't take anything except my backpack, a flashlight, and the axe. I followed the road back down the mountain, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see anyone, but I felt like I was being watched. It took me almost 6 hours to reach the nearest house. An old man answered the door. He let me in, gave me water, and let me use his phone. I called a tow truck and the police. When the officer showed up, I told him everything. He looked concerned but not surprised. He said there had been reports over the years, people hearing noises, seeing things, feeling watched. Some cabins had been broken into. No one had ever been caught. The tow truck driver took me back to the cabin. The front door was wide open when we got there. Everything inside was trashed. Dishes smashed, mattress shredded, lanterns broken. It looked like someone had gone through everything. But nothing was taken, just destroyed. We didn't stay long. I didn't want anything from that place. I told the owner he could keep my deposit. I just wanted to forget it. Weeks passed before I stopped jumping at every noise. I still checked the locks twice at night. Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. I went to that cabin to find peace, but all I found was fear. Real fear. The kind that stays with you. The kind that doesn't need ghosts or monsters. Just someone out there in the dark. Someone watching, waiting. I never found out who it was, or why they did what they did. But I know this. If I'd stayed one more night, I might not have made it out. And I will never go into those woods again. It was late October when I finally decided to take a break from the city and rent a remote cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I had been overworked for months, constantly staring at screens, stuck in traffic, surrounded by noise. The silence of a place deep in the woods seemed like exactly what I needed. I booked the place for 10 days, thinking I'd spend the time hiking, reading, maybe just sitting outside doing absolutely nothing. I wanted a full reset. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no people. The cabin was listed on a website for off-the-grid vacation rentals. The photos showed an old wooden structure surrounded by dense forest, perched near a small lake. It wasn't modern or fancy, just a simple one-room space with a wood-burning stove, a bed, a tiny kitchen, and an outhouse out back. It came with a fire pit, a rowboat, and a small axe for firewood. That was about it. Just the basics. It looked perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already beginning to drop behind the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road that led up to the property. The last half-mile was rough. Potholes and patches of mud made it feel like my car was going to lose a wheel, but I made it. When I stepped out, I could hear absolutely nothing except the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden porch. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. It was cold but not freezing. I carried my bags inside, stacked the firewood, and lit the stove. The place warmed up slowly. I unpacked some food into the cooler box, set up my sleeping bag on the bed for extra warmth, and tried to settle in. That first night was uneventful, and that was exactly what I hoped for. I read a book by lantern light, then fell asleep early. I slept harder than I had in months. No city noise, no vibrating phone on the nightstand, no headlights flashing across the ceiling. The next few days passed quietly. I spent the mornings hiking the trails that led away from the cabin in all directions. There were old logging paths, some barely visible through the undergrowth. I brought a compass and made sure not to wander too far, always backtracking to the cabin by late afternoon. I cooked simple meals, drank black coffee on the porch, and chopped firewood to keep warm. I kept a journal, just scribbling whatever came to mind. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. But by the fifth night, things started to feel a little strange. It began with the sound of branches snapping outside, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. At first, I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon. That wasn't unusual for a place like this. But the steps were too heavy, too slow. Not the quick, light movements of an animal. More like deliberate footfalls. I turned down the lantern and stood by the window, peeking through a gap in the curtain. I couldn't see anything in the dark. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers. I waited, but the sound didn't come closer. It just stopped. After a while, I climbed back into bed and told myself not to overthink it. The next morning, I noticed something that didn't sit right. About 20 yards from the front porch, near the tree lean, I found a single boot print. It wasn't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots with a distinct tread, and this one was different, narrower, older looking. The mud was still soft, so it had to be recent. I looked around but didn't see any others. Maybe it had been there before I arrived and I just hadn't noticed. Still, it put me on edge. I walked the perimeter of the property just to check for anything else out of place. Nothing. No trash, no broken branches, no signs of anyone else. By that afternoon, clouds had rolled in and the wind picked up. I stayed close to the cabin, collecting more wood and keeping the fire going. I skipped my usual hike and instead spent some time reinforcing the latch on the front door. It was just a simple wooden latch, not exactly secure. I wedged a metal rod from the fireplace across the door before going to bed that night. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to small sounds, the creak of the roof, a gust of wind shaking the walls. At around 3 in the morning, I heard a thud against the back of the cabin. Not loud, just enough to make me sit up. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing followed. After a few minutes, I grabbed the axe from next to the woodpile and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. I must have nodded off eventually, because the next thing I remember was the gray light of morning seeping through the window. I went outside and walked around the cabin. There, behind the back wall, I found something strange. A small pile of rocks stacked carefully, maybe 6 or 7 of them, just a few feet from the wall. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. Someone had been here. I I felt it in my stomach like a drop in pressure. That day, I stayed alert. I walked farther into the woods than usual, not because I was relaxed, but because I wanted to see if I could spot anyone. I kept my eyes open for signs of campfires, trash, footprints, anything. I found nothing. The forest was silent. The lake was still. I returned to the cabin and kept the axe with me inside. That night, I didn't light a fire outside. I wanted darkness. I wanted to see if anyone would come closer again. I sat by the window for hours, staring into the trees. Then I saw movement. Just past the tree line, a shape moved slowly between the trunks. Not an animal. It was upright. A man, I think. He didn't come closer. He just stood there for a long time, facing the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't want to give away that I saw him. After maybe 10 minutes, he stepped backward into the darkness and was gone. The next morning, I packed my bag. I didn't care if I had 5 days left on the reservation. I wasn't going to stay, but when I tried to start my car, the engine cranked and sputtered but wouldn't turn over. I opened the hood and checked what I could, but I'm not a mechanic. It all looked fine, but it wouldn't start. The gas tank was still half full. I slammed the door and paced in the clearing for a while, thinking I could hike out, but it was a long way, at least 10 miles down the main dirt road before I'd get to the county highway. I hadn't seen another cabin or car the entire time I'd been here. Still, I decided I'd leave the next morning. I'd pack light, take water and a snack, and walk until I found help. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the front door. Not pounding, scratching. Slow, scraping sounds like someone dragging something metal across the wood. I sat up, heart hammering, and grabbed the axe. I stood there in the dark, not daring to breathe. The sound moved from the front door to the side wall, then stopped. Then the back wall. It was like they were circling me. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I waited until the first light, threw on my pack, and started walking down the dirt road. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to. I didn't stop, even when I felt like someone might be watching me from the trees. I walked for hours, legs aching, until finally I heard the sound of an engine. A truck came into view, and I waved it down. The driver was a local man in his 60s. I didn't say much, just told him my car broke down and I needed a ride into town. He didn't ask questions. He drove me 20 miles to a gas station where I called a tow truck and then sat inside drinking coffee, trying to stop shaking. Later, when we returned to the cabin with the tow driver, my car started on the first try. No problem at all. He looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was starting to feel that way, but I knew what I saw. I knew someone had been out there. I left and never went back. I didn't report anything to the police. What would I say? That someone was lurking in the woods watching me? That they left stacks of rocks and stood in the dark staring at my cabin? Months later, I checked the rental website again. The cabin listing was gone. No trace of it, like it had never been there. But I still have the journal. And on one of the pages, dated the night I saw the man in the woods, I wrote a sentence that still makes my stomach twist every time I read it. He knows I'm here.